Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. Good evening to all. My name is Nathan, and today I want to share the story that my grandmother, still lucid and full of life at 95 years old, has always told me. She used to say that her mother, born in an isolated hamlet in the Appalachian Mountains, lived through this experience around 1915. In that era, communities were quite small, tranquil, and without access to transportation, with few houses and few people. But there was a singular beauty to the place. It was October 31st, the day when it's believed that the little angels returned to visit their loved ones. By little angels, I'm referring to children who died very young, some baptized, others not. They would have gone to limbo, a space where they say these children remain in darkness. That's why families prepare an offering on the date when they expect their visits. My grandmother's mother, still a young girl at that time, was given the task of fetching water early in the morning, around 6 o'clock. She took her pitcher to the stream, but ended up taking her time. Her mother, my great-great-grandmother, Beatrice Miller, scolded her for the delay. Then the girl recounted that while she was at the edge of the stream filling the pitcher, she saw several children passing by. They all walked happily, some singing, others praying, but all overflowing with joy. The girl hid behind the bushes, uncertain about these unknown figures. She found their appearance strange, but was entertained observing how they walked, jumping, and almost dancing. She decided to follow them to discover where they were going. To her surprise, she noticed that they entered houses. Some, however, seemed unable to enter and returned, taking again the path that led them to the trail toward the cemetery. Driven by curiosity, the girl decided to follow one of those who couldn't enter. She walked behind him without being noticed until the entrance of the cemetery. However, upon realizing he was being followed, the boy turned around, held the girl's hands with his incredibly cold ones, and murmured, "Then come with me. I don't want to go back alone." The girl tried to escape, but couldn't break free. At that moment, a man passed by leading his mules to work and shouted, "Hey, you there. Let that girl go, boy." The boy disappeared toward the cemetery, leaving the farm worker perplexed, understanding that it wasn't actually a child, at least not a living child. Trembling, the girl felt an intense cold next to the farm worker that seemed to reach her bones. She ran back home without even being able to thank the man, and only when safe did she tell what she had experienced. And that's why, my friends, we place so many sweets, bread, chocolate, a glass of water, and other foods on the altar, besides candles that illuminate the path to receive the little angels. And the next day, the faithful departed. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. Never pray to the dead, my friends. And if I can be clearer, especially avoid doing it in the early hours of the morning, as I did. The priest at the church warned me that asking for something in prayer is risky in itself. He advised that I should just talk to them, tell them my affairs. But today, I want to share what happened when I disobeyed and made a request, and who ended up answering me. When I lost my mother, my dear Elaine, I entered one of the darkest phases of my life. I sank into a deep depression, into a solitude that left me without direction. Despite being 35 years old, my routine always revolved around the shop, the church, and taking care of her. And then, suddenly, I found myself with nothing that truly gave meaning to my life. Thankfully, I still had the shop, our means of support since my childhood. But as they say, misfortune never comes alone. A few weeks after losing my mother, they demolished Mr. Wilson's bookstore on the corner to quickly erect one of those stores with large windows, just like so many others out there. And it was then that I realized the end of my little shop was closer than I imagined. Those were days of desperation. I cried watching that construction progress at full speed, not giving me time to prepare. In just 15 days, they were already operational, and customers began to stop coming. It was on one of those nights that I began to pray to my mother. I spoke to her, asked that if she were nearby and could hear me, that she would help me. I just had no idea what would follow. After several nights praying to my mother, something began to change. The house no longer seemed the same. The feeling of loneliness had vanished, but this didn't bring peace. On the contrary, my body, my mind, my heart began to feel a constant alert, an uncomfortable presence. On one of those early mornings, I sat before the small image of the Virgin that my mother always venerated. The environment was silent, with candles almost at their end, when I felt a peculiar cold. A cold that didn't come from outside, but from within, as if something had penetrated my soul. A desperate sensation. I don't know how long I sat there, until I heard a whisper. At first, I thought it was a delusion. Perhaps my exhausted mind was playing tricks on me. But the whisper continued. The words gained form in my head. Here I am, here I am, here I am, was what I finally understood. And then I recognized the voice. It was my mother's. My heart was invaded by a mixture of relief and fear. A brief relief, because I soon understood that it wasn't her. It couldn't be. I knew this. It went against everything I believed. In the days that followed, that presence, initially comforting, became increasingly intrusive. Each night, noises emerged in empty rooms. Things moved. Faucets opened on their own. I even heard the bathroom toilet flush, as if something wanted to manifest itself using all possible sounds to make me notice. The whispers became more distinct. My mother's voice emerged from the darkness, transforming into increasingly tense and uncomfortable murmurs, as if ordering me to continue praying, continue asking her for help. One night, I heard footsteps coming from the shop. I gathered my courage, went down with a candle in hand, and inside me, I already knew it wasn't a thief. Upon arriving, I found products scattered, thrown from one side to the other, as if someone had passed through in anger, knocking everything down. In the mirror across from the counter, which we used to see the back of the shop, I noticed a strange glow, something that moved too quickly to be just a shadow. But what frightened me most was seeing that amid the chaos, the photo of my mother that I had brought from home to keep her always present in the shop remained standing on the counter, intact, but with a different expression, almost a slight smile. The last time I prayed to her, was the worst of all. Already not knowing what to do, I begged for a sign, anything. All I wanted was proof that it was really her so that I could continue praying in peace, without fear. I said I was terrified and asked her to show me it was really her so I could trust. Then I felt a cold hand land on my shoulder. I was paralyzed, unable to move, and I heard her voice again, clear, close, as if she were at my side. But this time, what my saintly mother said was something I never imagined hearing. No, I am not your mother. Whatever was responding to my prayers was not my mother. When I heard that voice again, I realized it was all a macabre trap, something sinister that used my pain, my anguish, my loneliness, and my grief to feed itself. And when I realized this, it was already too late. Since then, I am no longer alone in this house. There is something here, something that doesn't want to leave, something that lives off my despair. I can no longer sleep or pray. All I can do is wait, for I feel that at some point, this thing will come to claim me. Curiously, the sadder I get, the closer this presence seems to be. In recent weeks, I've started selling more stationary items, things that the big store on the corner doesn't offer, taking advantage of the fact that Mr. Wilson's bookstore was removed. Sales have helped me think that at least I won't go hungry. And with this new tranquility, I notice that I feel less of this thing around me. This thing that pretends to be my mother, the very one I once invoked and now don't know how to expel. The priest helps me, but deep down, I know he doesn't fully believe me. So people, if one day you feel the temptation to ask something of your dead, remember my words. They are not listening. Something else does it, something that remains lurking, waiting just for a chance. And when that door opens, there's no longer a way to close it. Good evening, everyone. The world of the paranormal has always fascinated me. Throughout my life, I've experienced some paranormal events, although most have been isolated incidents. Viewed separately, they might seem mundane, shadows in the corner of my eye, sounds in the house that no one can explain. But today, I've chosen to share the most intense experience I've ever had. Something that lasted, in fact, long minutes, perhaps hours, with a presence that I'm not sure is part of our world. This story happened a few years ago, approximately 4, and only now do I feel prepared to tell it. It was the beginning of January, around the 7th or 8th, if my memory doesn't fail me. At that moment, we were not yet in lockdown for the pandemic, but COVID was already known in the United States. We were living as if everything were normal, as if that would never reach us. I live in Providence, Rhode Island, and at that phase of my life, I was pursuing my degree at Brown University. This information is important, as the locations I'll mention have great relevance. For those unfamiliar with the city, I recommend looking up the streets on Google Maps to better follow along. It all began on an apparently ordinary day. My classes started in the afternoon, with nothing special happening. In the middle of the afternoon, we were informed that the 2 last classes would be canceled. So instead of leaving at 7 at night, we would be free a bit before 5. When the last class of the day ended, it was about 4:50. As always, I waited for my best friend so we could say goodbye or do something together, taking advantage of the earlier end of the day, as we occasionally did. Once outside the classroom, we exchanged that look of those who understand each other with just a glance, and he immediately suggested, "How about a beer?" "It's still early, right?" I agreed without thinking twice. My best friend lived just minutes from the university. As being from another city, he rented an apartment near the campus, specifically on Thayer Street, almost at the corner with Waterman Street. Those who know Providence know that this route is a walk of about 10 minutes. So we headed to his apartment, and on the way, we each bought a beer. At the time, a light beer with lime and salt, with about 2% alcohol, had just been launched, and that's exactly what we chose. I mention this because I firmly believe that what happened afterward cannot, in any way, be attributed to the effects of alcohol. Between the walk from the university and the stop to buy beer, we arrived at his apartment around 5:15. While having our drinks, the conversation flowed as is typical among university students: professors, assignments, projects, and everything else. I finished my beer, checked my cell phone, and realized it was almost 6 o'clock. I mentioned to my friend that I should go soon, to take advantage of the earlier hour and avoid problems with the buses, since later they get crowded or take too long. We said goodbye. I went down to the gate, and when I started walking and checked my cell phone again, it was a bit after 6 in the evening. I walked along Thayer Street and turned right to enter Waterman Street, heading to the bus stop on Benefit Street. As I walked along Waterman, something began to seem strange. Even though it was relatively early and I was already close to downtown, the streets were almost deserted. That stretch is usually quite busy at this hour, so this caught my attention. The few people who crossed my path were different from the usual. Not that they were exactly like ghosts, but they also didn't seem like the type of person leaving work or some commitment. Some were standing there with a lost air, dirty clothes, and some seemed a bit out of it. I thought they might be homeless people, which is common in the downtown area, often wandering around, whether due to hunger or under some kind of influence. The empty streets and the fact that I wasn't in a hurry made me not even check my cell phone again. But considering the proximity between my friend's apartment and the bus stop, I calculate I must have reached Benefit Street around 6:10. Those who know the area will know which stop I'm talking about, the one at the John Brown House Museum. It was there that I felt something truly strange. The stop was completely empty. There wasn't a single person besides me, an uncommon scenario, as there are usually plenty of people waiting for transportation there at any time of day. I looked around and had the strange impression that the city was completely empty. No vehicles were passing, neither cars nor buses. In my head, I thought, it must still be very early, because the few times I had waited at that stop, it was already after 7 at night, a time when there were normally several people waiting. I used to catch the bus at another location, at the Brown stop on South Main Street. Without giving much importance to the situation, I decided to calmly wait for any bus that could leave me on South Main Street to transfer. Even better if one came that would leave me closer to home. After a few minutes, I noticed someone approaching from the corner of my eye. I turned my face, and indeed, a man was walking in my direction. I didn't pay much attention and went back to focusing on the buses, hoping one would appear soon. It was then that the man stopped beside me and asked, "What are you doing here alone?" I remained calm. as I'm the type who doesn't get scared easily. I've been through so many situations that I don't usually get uneasy. And after all, maintaining tranquility is always better, especially when you don't know if the other person has dubious intentions. I turned to observe him more carefully. He seemed like an ordinary person, somewhat unkempt clothes, about my height, around 30 years old, brown skin, very short hair, and a somewhat rough appearance. I replied, "Nothing special, just waiting for the bus." "And you?" That's when the man flashed me a smile that caused a discomfort that wasn't exactly fear, but something inexplicably disturbing. What disconcerted me wasn't the smile itself, but his teeth. The best way to describe it would be to say he had shark teeth, all sharp, like a row of canines, all identical and pointed. They seemed to have been sculpted that way, like someone who gets a body modification similar to splitting their tongue. That's how his teeth were. Since I had no idea of the man's intentions or if he was completely in his right mind, I preferred not to show any kind of unease or displeasure, out of respect and caution. So I just waited for him to respond. After that strange smile, exhibiting his bizarre teeth, he said, "I'm looking for someone to accompany me. Do you want to come with me?" I replied no, that I was just waiting for the bus to go home, and I looked at the street as if wanting to end the subject. We remained in silence for a few seconds, and the street continued to be deserted. He started a conversation again, but now with a more casual tone. "I was at a party drinking with a girl who was on my lap, but my money ran out, so I decided to leave." I thought to myself, what do I have to do with this? But it wasn't the moment to be rude to someone so strange, especially with the street completely empty. So I just agreed, "That's too bad." "It happens." He smiled again, and once more those strange teeth were on display. Then he asked, "Do I seem drunk?" "No, you look fine," I responded. That's when he got uncomfortably close and said, "You can smell my breath. See if you can smell alcohol," and opened his mouth, as if making a point that I should get a good look at those horrible teeth. I took a step back and said, "I don't think I'll be able to tell. I just had a drink myself, so I won't be able to smell alcohol." As I spoke, I thought to myself, this guy must be crazy, thinking I'm going to smell his mouth. The man, with that strange smile, closed his mouth and suggested, "Well, let's do this. I'll invite you for a drink, and I'll get some girls for us." "No, thanks. I need to go home," I replied, suspecting he wanted something more. He had just said he was out of money, and now he was inviting me out. It made no sense. Silence hung again, and there was still no one around, not even cars. I just wanted the bus to come soon, so I could get away from that guy. "So you're not coming with me?" he asked, breaking the silence. I firmly replied, "No, I'm going home." I looked around, and finally a bus was approaching. I didn't even pay attention to the route. All I wanted was to get out of there, even if I had to get off at the next stop. I signaled for the bus, and the stranger asked, "Is that your bus?" I simply replied, "Yes, I'm going." I thought the strange things would end there, but the night still had surprises. I boarded the bus, and when trying to validate my prepaid card, noticed there was no reader. I spoke with the driver, explaining that I only had the card, no cash, and he replied it wasn't a problem, that I could sit down. The bus was almost empty, only 5 other people besides the driver and me. However, when observing the other passengers, It seemed like the bus was full of homeless people, with all due respect. Their clothes were torn, dirty, and many seemed disoriented. One of the men, who must have been about 50, was extremely thin, almost just skin and bones, and was contorting himself in a strange way. I immediately thought he might be under the effect of some substance. I decided not to pay more attention and thought, I'll get off as soon as I can. The bus continued along Benefit Street, and I planned to get off at the corner with South Main Street. However, when passing through this point, I noticed it was also empty, which made me decide to continue on the bus until the brown stop, where there were always many people because it was the time classes let out. I would feel safer there, among a familiar crowd. To my surprise, when we arrived at the stop, it was completely empty. I imagined that perhaps it was still a bit early, and students hadn't left yet, since most usually leave at 7 o'clock. According to my calculations, it couldn't be later than 6:30. I had arrived at the John Brown House Museum stop around 6:10. Adding the brief conversation with that guy and the 10 minutes on the bus, it certainly wouldn't be more than 6:30. I decided not to get off, but soon thought that in reality, I didn't know the final destination of the bus. I could have asked the driver, but I was already a bit confused. So I got up, prepared to get off at the next stop. I finally got off the bus on South Main Street, at the corner with College Street. Once again, I was astonished to see the stop completely empty, and this stop always has several people waiting, as it's an industrial area where many workers catch buses at the end of their shifts. I no longer knew what to think, but seeing some cars passing on the road brought me a certain relief. I waited about 5 minutes, and the bus didn't appear. Suddenly, a car passed, and then reversed until stopping right beside me. The passenger window began to lower, and I thought, what now? Who's in there? When the window completely lowered, someone called me by name. I bent down a bit to see who was driving and heard my name again, along with the question about what I was doing there. To my surprise, it was one of my cousins who lives quite close to where I live. "Oh, sorry, I didn't recognize your car," I said with a nervous smile. She told me to get in, that she would give me a ride home. Already inside the car, she asked what I was doing there so late, according to her. Buses weren't even running anymore at that hour. I replied, "What do you mean?" "I left early. There are still buses. They only stop running at 10:30. She looked at me strangely, without saying anything, and pointed to the car clock. It was 11:40. Incredulous, and with an increasingly awkward smile, I insisted that her clock must be wrong, because it was at most 6:40. I was certain of this by my calculations. Not even an hour had passed since I left my friend's house. My cousin, still confused, responded, "I left work at 11 o'clock and still spent some time talking with a friend. How can it be 6:40? This made complete sense after all. It's true that my cousin, on the afternoon shift, leaves work at 11 at night. I quickly took out my cell phone and confirmed. It was already after 11:40. I saw several missed calls from my mother. Still trying to process what was happening, another call from her came in. She wanted to know how I was, where I was going, and why I wasn't responding. Not knowing quite what to say, and to avoid going into details about something I didn't even understand myself, I replied that I was with a friend. That time had passed quickly, and that I hadn't noticed the calls, but that I was already with my cousin and not to worry. As soon as I hung up, my cousin looked at me and commented, "Ah, I see. You weren't coming from school. I bet you were out having fun." I still didn't understand how I had lost 5 hours of my night, so I just said I had spent some time with a friend and that it took me a while to catch the bus. She apparently wasn't convinced or noticed the confusion on my face, as she soon asked again if I was okay. Finally, she dropped me off at home, almost at midnight. I said goodbye, went inside, and tried to leave everything behind. In my head, I thought that maybe I had left my friend's apartment later, which would justify the city being so empty and would make everything easier to explain. But to eliminate the doubt, the next day I asked my friend if he remembered what time I left, and he confirmed. I had indeed left at 6 in the evening. I know this account isn't the most terrifying, but there's something very strange about it that leaves me full of questions. Who were those peculiar people? And that man with the sharp teeth, who or what was he? Where did he really want to take me? And what happened to those 5 hours that somehow disappeared from my time? Were those beings from another plane? Or was it I who, for some reason, momentarily crossed over to another? I would very much like to hear what you all think. I thank you for your attention and send you a hug, wishing you an excellent night. But above all, I ask that you be very careful the next time you go out at night and notice the streets strangely empty. Jessica and I have been together for 10 years, and 2 years ago, we decided to get married. Recently, less than a month ago, we bought a new house, but the move didn't exactly start as we had planned. We moved to a small town in northern Michigan called Harbor Springs. These are the details I can share to avoid possible complications. Our house is on a quiet street, on a large property right across from a wooded area, one of the points that most caught our attention. We want to adopt a dog and raise children here, so having space for them to play outdoors was fundamental. Our work schedules are similar. I usually get home around 5, while she typically arrives around 6 on most days. The first nights were completely normal. Since it was the weekend, we spent the days unpacking everything. On Monday night, about 20 minutes after we turned off the lights, we heard loud music coming from the backyard. There was no way it could be from the neighbors. They're distant enough that any sound from there wouldn't be heard here. It was undoubtedly in our yard. The music wasn't festive. It was an old melody with a vintage sound, full of static. With the windows closed, Jessica and I exchanged a frightened look, trying to understand where the sound was coming from. I opened the window on my side of the bed, and it became clear. It was a song from the 40s, something I later discovered when researching the lyrics, called "Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf?" performed by Henry Hall. For some reason, this song has a strange vibe, even though it was made to be a cheerful tune. But coming from our backyard, the sensation was one of pure discomfort. We were still familiarizing ourselves with the house, but I presumed there must be a switch for the yard lights downstairs. I went down to the back door and tested the switches near it, and one of them lit up the yard. There was no one in sight. I opened the door, and the sound became even clearer. I walked across the grass, and then realized that the music wasn't exactly in the yard, but coming from the forest. It continued playing while I stood there, alert to my surroundings. As soon as the music ended, everything went silent. It seemed like a welcome prank in poor taste, but I didn't find it funny at all. When I returned inside, I told my wife it was probably some kids trying to play a prank on the new residents, for whatever reason. As soon as I said it, I realized how ridiculous and weird that explanation sounded. Who would do something like that? The next night, the scene repeated itself. Shortly after we turned off the lights in the bedroom, the music began again, louder than before. This time it was a song everyone knows, "Tiptoe Through the Tulips." Jessica and I exchanged glances once more, now with a mixture of concern and revulsion. We had hoped it was an isolated incident, but it was happening again. I looked out the window, and this time noticed something on the grass. It didn't seem like a person, but there was definitely something there. I told my wife I was going to take a look. She suggested we call the police, and I replied that we would do that in a moment. I left with the feeling that I needed to show who was in charge, both to my wife and to anyone who thought they could intimidate us just because we were new to the neighborhood. Upon reaching the yard, I saw that the object on the grass was smaller than I thought, but the strident and disturbing music was coming from it. It was an old radio. I turned off the device and looked at the window where my wife was watching, raising it to show her and shouting that someone had left it there to scare us with that music. What she did next caught me completely by surprise. She began to scream my name, ordering me to run inside. She kept screaming, "Run," I asked. "Why?" And she replied amid the screams, "There are people behind you." Hearing that, I felt my heart race and quickly turned to face the forest. I could see 3 figures standing about 6 feet away from each other, all facing me. They weren't running in my direction. They just stood there motionless. I let out an "oh crap" and sprinted back inside, slamming the door behind me. My wife was already upstairs, crying uncontrollably. I said I would call the police and grabbed the phone. Fortunately, they didn't take long to arrive. While we waited, we feared hearing any knocks on the doors or windows. As soon as the officers entered, we explained everything, still very shaken, and I showed them the radio that was on the ground. I asked them to take the device to collect fingerprints and warned that I had only touched the handle. They took the radio with them, checked the forest front with their flashlights for a few minutes, probably to scare off anyone who might still be there. After they left, we felt somewhat abandoned and insecure, but thank God those people never appeared again. This happened just a few weeks ago. God forbid if they return, and if they do, I'll try to capture it on video. There was an abandoned house about a mile outside my hometown of Pinewood, Vermont. It sat alone in a clearing surrounded by dense forest, isolated enough that despite everyone at school talking about it, few actually ventured there. During my senior year of high school, in 2015, my friend Marcus, who had just gotten his license, decided it would be the perfect Halloween adventure to visit this place. It wasn't difficult to convince our group of friends to join in. By sunset, the 6 of us were crammed into Marcus's old Subaru, waiting for darkness to fall to make the experience even more frightening. As the last light faded from the sky, we parked in the overgrown yard. The space was vast, with untamed vegetation spreading in every direction. There were no street lights or nearby houses, so our flashlights provided the only illumination. We began walking slowly from the car toward the entrance, with Marcus leading the way, his flashlight beam dancing across the weathered facade of the house and illuminating every eerie detail. I followed the light as he explored different sections until I noticed something on the porch that seemed out of place. Something I only glimpsed for a moment as the light passed over it. I took out my own flashlight to check what I had seen, and there it was, a pumpkin sitting on the porch. But this wasn't an old or rotting pumpkin, as you might expect at an abandoned house. This was a freshly carved jack-o'-lantern. I mentioned to the group that perhaps someone was living there, given the presence of a recently carved pumpkin. Marcus just shrugged, saying it was Halloween, and someone had probably left it there as a prank. We continued forward, but it wasn't long before we heard a sound coming from around the side of the house. I pointed my flashlight in that direction, just in time to see someone approaching from the side of the building. It was a man peering around the corner, who had clearly been watching us when my light found him. He was holding an enormous knife in his hand. The moment he realized his presence had been discovered, he began advancing toward us as quickly as he could. I say as quickly as he could, because he moved in a strange way, half limping and half running, as if he were injured or missing part of his leg. Fortunately, all my friends saw him too, and we turned to run back to the car as fast as possible. As I scrambled into the vehicle, I looked back and saw the man still coming after us. When we finally drove away, two of my friends started laughing, confessing they had planned the prank. They said they'd called a guy from school to go there early and wait to scare us. I was the only one who had gotten a clear view of the man who chased us, and I knew he definitely wasn't a high school student. I told my friends, insisting that the person who chased us wasn't the guy they had arranged to scare us. Finally, they checked their phones and found voice messages and texts from their accomplice asking to call off the plan. He explained that he had gone to the house, but was chased away by the same man before he could even set up to scare us. He had left several messages, but my friends hadn't seen them due to poor reception. We never discovered who tried to attack us that night, or why. When police investigated, they found no one at the location. Years later, I still drive past that house on my way to visit my parents. I always speed up a little when I pass, and I've never seen another pumpkin on that porch again. The early years of the 2000s were truly intense for anyone working as a crime reporter in Western Oregon. When I moved from Nebraska in the spring of 2005, I practically doubled my salary, going from $32,000 to $65,000 annually, a considerable amount for a rookie reporter at that time. The curious thing is that I wasn't even at one of Portland's major newspapers. My job was at a smaller, more local publication called the Silverton Chronicle. There's a somewhat morbid expression in journalism. If it bleeds, it leads. And the newspaper had been experiencing high circulation since the drug violence from Portland began spilling into the suburbs. The situation involved truly horrific scenes, gang reprisals, random killings, even explosions, and that justified my salary increase. Over time, though, you begin to notice the corrosive impact that covering these events has on society as a whole. It's as if something contaminates the water or infects the collective consciousness. And for a period, it seemed like almost everyone in Silverton was involved in something suspicious. For me, perhaps the most striking example of this was what I often call the biggest story I never wrote. On Saturday, October 31st, 2007, there was a party at one of the large houses on Riverway Drive. A prosperous boat dealer had allowed his 17-year-old daughter to organize a Halloween party in his backyard. She invited all her friends, and the night was unforgettable for them. At midnight, the father politely ended the party, and everyone spilled out onto the streets, gradually beginning to head home, everyone except one. The following morning, the parents of a girl named Amber Parks reported her missing to the Washington County Sheriff's Office. Initially, expectations were grim. The houses on Riverway Drive, like the streets around them, were built next to an artificial canal where residents typically anchored their boats right beside their backyards. With this setup, police immediately considered that since some girls had smuggled alcohol into the party, Amber might have wandered off, fallen into the water, and drowned. Some had their doubts because no one had heard screams or any sound of someone falling into the canal. But still, the officers decided to drag the location in search of human remains, at least to rule out that possibility. However, nothing was found. 3 days after the search began, with authorities increasingly anxious, a truck driver was driving near a lake at the beginning of Valley Highway when he spotted a semi-naked girl stumbling out of the woods by the roadside. He stopped his truck, got out, and after offering his jacket to cover her, asked what she was doing there alone with some of her clothes missing. Later, the truck driver stated that the young woman appeared intoxicated and couldn't remember where she was or how she got there. The only thing she recalled was her own name, Amber Parks. As you might imagine, Amber's family was overjoyed to see their daughter return alive, but she didn't come back unscathed. After a complete medical examination, it was determined that Amber had been drugged, kidnapped, and over the next 48 hours, subjected to repeated assaults. Instead of taking her life, the kidnappers sedated her one last time, took her to Valley Highway in the middle of the night, and left her in a wooded area. Amber was relatively calm and appeared stable, while the drug's effects still lingered. However, when the effect completely wore off, the situation drastically changed. The trauma of what she had experienced over the past days was too intense for her young mind to bear. And from what I understood, she suffered a severe nervous breakdown. Amber stopped attending school, withdrew from friends, and even with extensive medication and therapy, remained mentally and emotionally shattered, trapped in the horrors she glimpsed through the fog of her memories. What made the situation infinitely more painful was that the investigation to find her attackers quickly stalled. The lack of progress in the case generated fear and concern among Silverton residents. Many spoke out vehemently, demanding justice, but no one was more insistent than the owner of the house where the party took place. To avoid potential legal issues, I'll change some names, as this man is still quite litigious, and I wouldn't want you to be penalized just for listening to my account. Instead of his real name, I'll call him Mr. Hayes. Mr. Hayes offered a reward of up to $10,000 for anyone who helped bring those responsible for the attack on Amber to justice. He also offered to hire a private investigator to accelerate the process. But Amber's family declined his help in this regard. Nevertheless, Mr. Hayes remained firm and publicly emphatic in his demands for justice, even putting up a billboard outside his store for a time, appealing to the public for information. When we met at a charity auction in the spring of 2008, it was he who suggested I begin investigating in depth, offering his full collaboration in the hope that my reporting would help capture Amber Park's kidnappers. I couldn't dedicate myself to the case full-time, as I still had other responsibilities. But my editor gave me free rein to work on it whenever possible, provided he had the first option to publish the content. Although the police never arrested or charged anyone for Amber's kidnapping, they did question several people connected to the incident. The first was a young man with whom Amber allegedly had a relationship and who had reacted badly when she ended it. He was also at the party, but based on several alibis, was ruled out as a suspect. The second person questioned was a security guard hired by Mr. Hayes to ensure guests stayed away from the canal behind the house. The security guard reported that at one point during the night, Amber approached him to talk. He noticed signs that she was intoxicated, so concerned that someone had brought alcohol to the party, which indeed happened. He went to inform Mr. Hayes. Hayes instructed him to go back and look for the source of the alcohol to confiscate it. However, when the security guard returned, Amber was no longer around. Assuming she had dispersed among the teenagers who were dancing, he returned to work, trying to track the source of the drinks. He didn't see Amber again that night, and only learned she was missing the following morning. The third person the police questioned, and who for a time was their prime suspect, was an ex-convict who resided at a construction site in Cascade Estates. Cascade Estates is one of the wealthiest areas in western Oregon, with most homes offering more than 10,000 square feet and luxury amenities like gourmet kitchens, wine cellars, and spacious outdoor areas. This raised the question, what would an unemployed ex-convict be doing living in such a place? The ex-convict, Frank Reynolds, had started living among the remains of an abandoned construction project, and due to some loopholes in legislation, authorities couldn't remove him. Somehow, he had acquired a small boat that he used to reach the wealthier neighborhoods on the edges of Silverton, from where he would escape after committing petty thefts and vandalism. Reynolds had been arrested half a dozen times, usually for trespassing or abusive behavior, but his original conviction was much more serious. About 20 years earlier, he had been imprisoned after kidnapping his neighbor's 14-year-old daughter, pushing her into his car while she was walking home from school. If it weren't for several witnesses who wrote down the car's license plate, it's hard to imagine what he might have done with the girl. Police intercepted Reynolds as he tried to take her to the National Forest, which earned him 16 years in prison for aggravated kidnapping, despite his frustrated attempts to appeal. Now, with his freedom restored, Reynolds seemed to be resuming old habits. It was Mr. Hayes who first alerted police about him, as his family had already had several unpleasant encounters with the man, including one where he frightened Hayes' 16-year-old daughter while she was sunbathing. Since leaving prison, Reynolds had been causing problems. and by spring 2008, he was the primary suspect in Amber Park's case. Reynolds was questioned several times, but his alibis for the night of Amber's kidnapping were, at best, inconsistent. Still, without concrete evidence, the police couldn't arrest him. It was only a matter of time until they got something on him. After a break-in at a marine supply store in Silverton, police tried to arrest Reynolds. However, when they arrived at the shack where he was hiding, he opened fire with a .45 caliber pistol. As you might imagine, the officers didn't react well to Reynolds deciding to go out in a blaze of glory. Nevertheless, they attended to him, and amid a hail of gunfire, the main suspect in Amber's kidnapping and assault didn't survive. I spoke with Mr. Hayes after Reynolds' death, and although he lamented that the prime suspect would never properly face justice, he commented that there were far worse ways for such a situation to end. To be honest, I tended to agree with him. After covering serious crimes across Oregon and Nebraska for 5 whole years, I knew that when it comes to child predators, the risk of recidivism never completely disappears. Perhaps his death at the hands of police wasn't true justice, but it was still a form of justice. For Silverton residents, it was as if a great weight had been lifted from their shoulders. It was as if Reynolds had written the ending to my article by going out in a blaze of glory, so to speak. I thought all that was left was to tie up a few loose ends from the information I had already collected, and then I would have an article so complete and detailed that I could even attach a raise request when I handed it to my editor. But those loose ends soon revealed themselves as loose threads of a sweater. The more I pulled, the more the entire story began to unravel before my eyes. Reynolds had 2 alibis for the night of Amber's kidnapping. To get around, he needed his boat or to walk, and it was thus that he ended up drunk passing by a neighbor's house that night. According to Reynolds himself, he was, and I quote, drunk singing and yelling so loudly as he passed the neighbor's house that the man appeared at the window to look at him disapprovingly. Reynolds claimed that the two then made eye contact, long enough for him to give the neighbor the middle finger, and after shouting some obscenities, the neighbor closed the curtains and presumably went back to sleep. However, when the police sought out the neighbor to confirm the story, he claimed it never happened. No one had reason to doubt the man. He might not have liked Reynolds, but surely not to the point of lying in court, right? But it was this discrepancy that made me realize not everything was as it seemed. I heard from a police officer, whose identity I'll keep anonymous, that Reynolds' neighbor changed his version of events once he realized the ex-convict's freedom was at stake. Initially, he stated that he had heard Reynolds returning home, but later corrected himself, saying he only assumed it was Reynolds without actually seeing him. He didn't get out of bed, nor did he close the curtains after Reynolds' offensive gesture. Everyone somehow knew the man was lying. I believe the police when they say they develop a nose for lies. I myself developed this instinct over the years. But if he despised Reynolds to the point of risking perjury, there wasn't much the police could do to stop him, especially because Reynolds was becoming a convenient scapegoat. Reynolds' second alibi came from a visit to a bar late that night, a discreet place called The Anchor near Crescent Beach. When officers contacted the owner, he promptly handed over the security camera footage from that night. However, upon reviewing the images, They concluded they weren't clear enough to identify Reynolds with certainty, and decided not to formally register them as evidence. Moreover, instead of returning the tape to the owner, the police simply kept it. I discovered this when I went to talk to the bar owner, and as it was just a seemingly worthless VHS tape, he wasn't exactly inclined to seek out a lawyer over it. However, he was still irritated and took the opportunity to vent his frustrations with the police for a good 10 minutes. I let him talk, waiting patiently, and then tried to bring the conversation back to the security footage. I ended up discovering that he still had the original tape around and was more than willing to show it to me. Remember, this all happened in 2008, so even the best security camera footage was quite grainy compared to the crisp images you can capture today. But Frank Reynolds wasn't exactly discreet. He loved flashy colors, wore tank tops, swimming shorts, and sandals, and sported a bleached, messy strand of hair, almost like a mohawk. This eye-catching style made him easily recognizable, especially due to his petty crimes. When the owner of the Anchor showed me the recording from that night, there was Frank, as clear as day. Although his face didn't appear clearly, and someone could argue it might be a person who looked like him, the description I had of him made me confident that if someone who knew him saw those images, they would identify Reynolds without hesitation. The question that lingered in my mind was why the footage wasn't used for positive identification. To get answers, I spoke with one of the officers who worked on the case before Reynolds' death. He explained that under the guidance of a renowned attorney, they were informed that the recording would not be legally valid if the image didn't display clear facial features, scars, or tattoos. Reynolds' future defense attorneys could contest its authenticity, so it didn't constitute a sufficiently strong alibi. I remember commenting to him that if I were a juror, I would consider the recording solid evidence if Reynolds himself were in front of me, with that identical blonde streak from the tape. But the officer just shook his head and replied that the decision was beyond his reach. Under the attorney's guidance, his superiors determined that the recording would not be considered a valid alibi, and Reynolds should continue as the prime suspect. To me, this seemed like a huge mistake, so I was very curious to find out who this wise attorney was. The officer made a call, and then informed me that the attorney's recommendation had come from Mr. Hayes himself. I knew the police weren't inclined to review the tape, but I imagined Mr. Hayes would be interested, especially if his attorney had made such a serious error. I went directly to find him, but his reaction was similar to that of the police department. He thanked me for my concern, but suggested I follow the attorney's advice. Reynolds was the most likely suspect, and now he was dead. Case closed. I asked if he had seen the footage from the bar near Crescent Beach, and he said no. I then mentioned that I was beginning to consider the possibility that Amber Park's real attacker wasn't Reynolds, and that the criminal might still be at large. Suddenly, Mr. Hayes started yelling at me. I remember him asking, "Who do you think you are, my friend?" Then, indirectly, he accused me of using a tragedy to boost my career. I replied that was the last thing I would do, and that my only concern was finding Amber's real attacker before he targeted someone else. Mr. Hayes' reaction was to state that if that were truly my interest, I would respect the judgments of people more qualified than myself. Any different attitude would only amplify the victim's pain. My last question before he hung up on me was whether he would at least view the security footage himself. After that question, all I heard was the silence of the cut line. Hayes' words about only increasing pain and suffering echoed in my head for days, and I really found myself questioning whether my motivations were selfish. Perhaps for him, letting the Parks family believe Reynolds was responsible for Amber offered some kind of closure, and convincing them otherwise seemed inadmissible. It was evident that Hayes wanted to end this dark chapter once and for all. For me, however, bringing the true culprit to justice was the greatest gift I could give the Parks family. They didn't just need a sense of justice, they needed concrete justice. And as time passed, I felt more and more that this responsibility fell on me. Until then, I had never spoken with Amber. I didn't think it was necessary. But faced with so many obstacles, I decided that exploring all possible avenues was the only way out. Amber had been extensively interviewed after the incident, but I wanted to ensure nothing had been overlooked by the police. I called her parents and asked if I could talk to her. As I mentioned, Amber faced many difficulties in recovery. So initially, her parents hesitated to let her speak with a reporter, especially from a small publication. However, after a frank conversation with her father, Patrick, he invited me to their home. Initially, Amber told me very little that I didn't already know, and any new details seemed irrelevant enough to explain why they weren't in police reports. But there was one detail I found important. One of her attackers had a strong smell of cinnamon. This small detail wasn't in the police reports, and when I asked Amber why she hadn't mentioned it before, she replied that she actually had, on several occasions, without understanding why it wasn't recorded. And this wasn't the only detail that seemed to have escaped the official records. I asked if she was absolutely certain it was the attacker who smelled of cinnamon, and not some scent from the place where they kept her, like an air freshener. Amber assured me she had never been so certain of anything in her life. Although she was blindfolded most of the time, she knew that despite two men having kidnapped her, only one assaulted her, and every time it happened, she smelled the sweet aroma of cinnamon coming from his breath. Before leaving, I thanked Amber for her time and her father for arranging the meeting. The detail about the smell of cinnamon on the attacker's breath was entirely new to me, and I wondered what else might be covered up. It turns out the big clue was closer than I imagined. Almost everyone in Silverton knew Mr. Hayes and his daughter, but after nearly 8 months of investigation, I realized she wasn't an only child. Hayes, who organized the party, also had a son, a 17-year-old girl and a 19-year-old boy. While his daughter was a popular student and excellent in academics, the son didn't possess the same academic or social skills. Hayes' son, whom I'll call Junior, was diagnosed with learning difficulties as a child and enrolled in a special school. This was basically the most people knew about him. He was rarely seen outside the house, and when he appeared, he was always accompanied by his mother or a caregiver. The children who knew him described him as weird, saying he spent most of his time in his room, watching horror movies and reading comics. I asked some of the children present at the party if Junior had come down at any point or tried to interact with the guests. Most said no, that they didn't even know the Hayes family had a son. but 2 children mentioned seeing an older boy without a costume talking to one of Hayes' security guards. I then went to talk to the officer from the Washington County Sheriff's Office, the same one who had told me about Hayes' attorney rejecting Reynolds' alibi. He told me that Junior had never been questioned about what happened that night, and according to police information, he had stayed in his room the entire time. Do you understand what I mean about how things started to crumble? Some children said Junior briefly appeared at the party, but the police categorically told me he hadn't left his room all night. I asked how they were so sure, and you know what the officer replied? Because Mr. Hayes told us so. The last time I called Hayes also marked our final conversation. We weren't on good terms since our last call when he basically advised me to stop asking questions. So when I called him once more and asked to speak with Junior, he didn't hesitate. He simply hung up without comments, without excuses, just a click, and the line went dead. That was in early summer 2008. I didn't abandon the case, but that call represented the moment when my progress began to slow down. Without Hayes' support, and with the police's patience running out, it seemed like my only option was to set the investigation aside. There were other stories to cover, not necessarily more important, but I was a reporter, not an investigator. In the end, it was the published articles that paid the bills. I ended up writing about other matters, letting Amber Park's case fall into oblivion. By the end of October 2008, it had been a year since Park's kidnapping. Being Halloween season, I found myself thinking about the case even more. Halloween fell on a Friday, my only real day off, and I spent the night preparing homemade runners, reflecting on everything. Officially, the case was closed, but I knew Amber's attacker was still out there, and perhaps appropriately for the season, that haunted me like a restless spirit. I remember lying down that night and realizing it was the first time a story had escaped me. I imagined myself at 60, still obsessed with this case that remained unsolved. Curiously, this prediction ended up becoming reality, except for one detail. It was no longer an unsolved case. What I didn't realize on Halloween night 2008 was that less than 24 hours later, I would solve the mystery and discover not only who kidnapped Amber Parks, but also why. On Saturday, November 1st, I went to the Silverton Cache and Carrie to buy some groceries after work. I thought about the Parks case from time to time, but it was a regular day, and my mind was focused on the day's tasks. I grabbed a box of hamburger helper. I wasn't very skilled in the kitchen back then, along with other items, and got in the checkout line. When I looked ahead, I saw that the lady in front of me was one of Mr. Hayes' housekeepers, whom I had met once or twice when visiting him. We greeted each other, and as we talked, my eyes fell on the purchases she had placed on the conveyor belt. Besides several cleaning products, there was a considerable amount of Halloween candy, which I correctly imagined was on sale due to the end of the season. But what really caught my attention were 5 or 6 packages of the same candy, atomic fireballs. I commented to Maria, Hayes' housekeeper, that someone must really like those candies. I remembered them from childhood but never liked the name, atomic fireballs. The idea of burning my mouth didn't appeal to me, so I never got interested in them, just the name. And that was half the reason I made the comment, thinking to myself, who would be the little psychopath who would prefer an atomic fireball to a Jolly Rancher or a Lemonhead? Maria gave a little chuckle and told me all the packages were for Mr. Hayes' son, Junior. He loved those candies more than anything else, and was probably helping some dentist afford a luxury boat to match a vacation home in Newport Beach. While Maria was putting the purchases in paper bags, she picked up the last package of fireballs, looked at it, then at me, and commented something like, "Ah, cinnamon." There was a brief moment, perhaps just a millisecond, when I thought, "Oh, I didn't know it was a cinnamon flavor." And then everything clicked in my mind with the force of a meteor. Cinnamon, the same smell that Amber Parks had described when talking about her attacker, always present when he attacked her. Cinnamon, the favorite candy of Hayes' son, who spent his days watching horror movies and comics in a dark room on the third floor, and who, according to witnesses, had been seen talking to the security guard, the last to see Amber at the party. Frank Reynolds didn't have a van or a safe place where he could keep someone captive for days. Something like a storage unit, which is precisely where Amber believed she had been kept. Mr. Hayes, on the other hand, had the means to buy or rent practically anything. And perhaps, just perhaps, he had the resources and willingness to provide his socially inept son some private time with a young friend of his daughter who had caught his attention. At that time, as the pieces of the puzzle fit together, the idea seemed surreal, almost too insane to be true. Hayes was a pillar of the community, someone respected, admired, beloved. Imagining that he could be a cold psychopath, capable of facilitating the kidnapping and abuse of a young woman, seemed, at the very least, insane. The more I thought about it, the more everything began to fit. The gathering hadn't just been a Halloween party, but a kind of meat market where Junior could choose his victim. At the first opportunity, I called my editor to talk, and using a series of detailed hypotheses, I explained my reasoning and how I arrived at this conclusion. He looked at me open-mouthed for much of the time, especially at the end when I explained everything about Junior, or more precisely, how he should have been the prime suspect but wasn't even questioned. My editor pondered for about 15 or 20 seconds, and then said that if I could write the article in a way that avoided massive lawsuits, he would ensure the legal department reviewed it before publication. If only it were that simple. The day before I finished drafting the article, my editor called me into his office and showed me a preliminary copy of the next day's newspaper. Right in the middle, occupying 2 pages, Mr. Hayes had bought a full-page ad for his boat store, and another to exclusively promote his new line of jet skis. Hayes had signed a 2-year advertising contract with our newspaper worth almost $100,000. He knew that with that amount at stake, the newspaper owner would never allow a negative story about him. And so my editor told me we would have to archive the story about Junior. It might seem strange, but I wasn't surprised. Seeing that giant ad almost knocked me down, but I remember thinking, of course he bought an ad. Of course he did. He had all the power in the world, and I was just a scribbler at a small newspaper. If I insisted, maybe I'd end up with a pair of cement shoes, or something like that. Instead of risking my life and also my job, I chose to survive and abandon that story. I remember an old black and white film I saw in childhood. I can't recall the plot, but a woman collapsed in tears before a Humphrey Bogart-style character, lamenting how unfair the world was. He responded with something like, That's the way the world works, kid. Always has been, always will be. When I heard that at the time, I didn't believe it, but it seems that growing up and becoming an adult is essentially discovering that it's true, and that hardly anything so honest has ever been said. I've never had a specific reason to share my story before, but everything changed in October of last year when a group of neighborhood kids decided to torment me using manipulations and other forms of harassment that made my life unbearable. First of all, I need to be honest. I despise Halloween. If there's one date that illustrates everything I consider wrong with modern American society, it's October 31st. For me, this date marks the pinnacle of a culture that seems increasingly superficial and disposable. A period when large corporations rake in millions selling masks that people will wear for just a few hours. Don't misunderstand me. I enjoy candy like anyone else. But seeing this entire celebration revolve around capitalist interests bothers me more and more each year. Despite hating Halloween, that doesn't mean I don't tolerate it. And by tolerate, I mean I don't sit on my porch with a bucket of rocks ready to throw at any child who dares step on my sidewalk. I don't leave a bowl of candy for the little ones, who, it must be said, typically come from families that don't need to go out begging for sweets. But I do put a sign in front of my house saying, "No trick or treating, no exceptions," so they know they won't be served there. This sign worked in 2019 and also had an effect in 2020, a year when they shouldn't even have been on the streets. But last year, a group of children decided to ignore it and entered my yard to knock on my door. When I heard the knocking, I assumed it wasn't children asking for candy. So when I opened the door and came face to face with a group disguised as Avengers characters with low-quality costumes, the last thing I felt was sympathy. To begin with, those children seemed too old to be asking for candy. The boy dressed as Iron Man was at most 12 or 13, and the way they all shouted trick or treat in unison seemed so pretentious it almost made me nauseous. I looked at the boy trying to imitate Tony Stark and commented that his costume wasn't even faithful to the character's story. He gave me a confused look and asked what I was talking about. So I explained that the circle on Iron Man's chest is called an arc reactor and should actually be yellow. They chose to make the reactor blue in popular movies, putting a vibranium core just to sell more Black Panther tickets, even though the classic reactor is yellow or gold, representing different technological versions. When I finished, all four stared at me as if I were speaking another language. Then I went back inside and told them to get lost, slamming the door in their faces. I deal with generalized anxiety, and pathogen control is a major trigger for me. So this brief interaction already left me completely restless as I tried to return to my computer chair. But there wasn't much time to calm down before I heard someone knocking on the door again. I already knew who it was. It couldn't be anyone but those children again. I went to the door, and as expected, there were the Avengers with those tasteless costumes. When I asked what they wanted now, the Iron Man boy said, "You know we have to play a trick now, right?" That alone already made me furious, but as they laughed at having managed to irritate me, I finally lost my patience. I shouted that if they came near my house again, I would call their parents. And for the second time, I slammed the door in their faces. I returned to the computer, practically shaking with anger, because the level of insolence from these brats was absurd. They completely ignored my no trick or treating sign. In fact, I have the impression that the sign was the real reason they knocked on my door in the first place. To begin with, they can consider themselves lucky I'm not the type of person who calls the police for any little thing. Otherwise, I would have already dialed 911 and given the dispatcher a complete description of them. But being the discreet and peaceful person I am, I never call or get involved with the police. I tried to calm down a bit by doing some breathing exercises, and even opened up Destiny to see if I could relax by playing. However, not even 5 or 10 minutes had passed when I heard knocks on the door for the third time. I remember not being able to hold back a scream of frustration as I marched to the door. And when I opened it with an expression that probably looked like a storm about to form, I found myself facing a startled-looking woman with some children around her. When I yelled, asking if they were blind and hadn't seen the sign, she replied that there was no sign at all. I went to the porch, passing by the woman, and when I confirmed that there really was no sign there, I felt like I was going to faint. I think those Marvel brats had stolen my warning sign. I told the woman and the children to leave my property and went back inside, closing the door. I needed to sit on the steps, afraid I might fall and hit my head if I fainted, and decided that if I didn't take something to calm me down, the night would be quite complicated in terms of anxiety. The tranquilizers usually make me a bit drowsy, but they work quickly and always help me. I took one, made another sign that read, "No trick or treating," and this time taped it to the window to ensure no one would remove it. Finally, I could resume the peace of the night. But that peace lasted only about an hour. I was in the second round of one of my favorite games when, even with the muffled sound from my headphones, I heard 3 consecutive knocks and a dull noise followed by 2 more sounds in rapid succession. The first knock startled me, but the second and third sounds were so familiar that I already knew what had happened. And there it was, outside the window where I had put the sign, the mark of 3 broken eggs dripping down the glass. I was so stunned that it was as if I were completely detached from reality. I remember seeing the eggs, and then I only recall curling up in the bathtub with the knuckles of my right hand swollen and bleeding. I took a second pill, went to take a bath, and applied ointment to the wounds before deciding to take a nap. I thought that if I couldn't calm down by the time the alarm went off, I would give up on the day and take enough melatonin and doxylamine to knock me out for the whole night. This was around 7 in the evening, and when I woke up around 9, I felt much calmer. I decided to go back to Destiny to clear my head of all the stress, but first, I needed to eat something. So I went down to the kitchen in the dark. I prefer dim light in the morning to avoid sensory overload. I must have appeared to be out of the house or asleep, because I had barely started preparing a peanut butter and jelly sandwich when I heard a careful step on the loose paving stone beside my house. Whoever did the entrance work didn't adjust the foundations properly. So there's a stone near the gate leading to the backyard that wobbles and makes a sound whenever someone steps on it. Even a light step causes a soft dunk, and it was exactly this sound that I heard through the open kitchen window. My first reaction was to go back to my room, planning to hide until whoever it was wouldn't bother me. I wouldn't mind losing a few things in a possible theft, but the dread that the person might attack me, or something similar, only added to the pile of traumas I already carry. However, and sorry for the more detailed description, when I reached the bottom of the stairs, something caught my attention through the non-frosted part of the front door panel. Although it's frosted over most of the surface, there are small transparent strips on the edges. I looked outside and didn't see a suspicious van parked or a strange group approaching my door. Instead, I saw a group of children dressed in ordinary clothes, looking very much like the Marvel children who had been here earlier, with very similar heights. It wasn't an intruder going around my house. It was undoubtedly one of the same trick-or-treaters ready to play more tricks in my backyard. I put on my sneakers and went to the back door in the kitchen that leads to the yard. I waited for a few seconds, my hand on the doorknob, and then quickly opened the door, running out to the yard just in time to come face to face with the boy dressed as Iron Man. There are no words that can describe the satisfaction I felt seeing the expression of pure fear on his face. It was almost poetic, and for an instant I felt like an Avenger intercepting him as he tried to flee. He only had one way to run, but I caught him by surprise and managed to stop him easily. I've never been one to fight or play sports in school, so physical confrontation techniques aren't my forte. But with my 240 pounds thrown at him with all my strength, the impact was on target. He hit the wooden fence beside the house so hard that he slid to the ground before trying to get up. I say tried because, as you can imagine, I didn't let him get up. When he tried to scream, I instinctively placed my hand over his throat and mouth to silence him. He was shorter and weaker, so holding him like this seemed almost too easy. With both hands, I held firmly around his neck, and the way it completely silenced him is something I can't even describe. But as I squeezed and lifted him off the ground, watching his legs thrash, I realized that if I continued, I risked seriously hurting him. It wasn't my intention to really hurt him. I just wanted to scare him. And since I know the difference between squeezing to block breathing and squeezing to reduce blood flow, don't ask how I know this. I decided to play with him a little. I loosened the overall grip on his neck, but maintained pressure on the sides of the larynx, which decreased blood flow to the brain. Just counting to 5 was enough, and the boy went from thrashing like a fish out of water to going limp like cooked spaghetti. I know I shouldn't have laughed, but my God, his little face looked comical as he began to snore. His eyelids were half open, and his eyes had rolled back. And as I laid him on the ground and dragged him further into the yard, I couldn't contain my laughter. He woke up again when we reached the grass, but he was so dizzy and disoriented that he seemed to have no idea what was happening or even where he was. He mumbled something like Brian or Ryan, probably thinking it was his friend pulling him across the grass. When I stopped dragging him and he looked at me, I had another opportunity to see that look of pure terror. He tried to stammer something like, "Please don't," as I approached him. He tried to roll away, but before he could go very far, I wrapped my arm around his neck and squeezed again to prevent him from screaming. I need to say that despite everything, I'm not a bad person. At no point did I think about really hurting the boy. Still, it was fun to let him think that might happen. As I squeezed at the right point on his neck, I said these would be the last seconds of his life. That's when he really started to struggle. But he soon lost his strength again, and I laid him back on the grass beside me. I wish I had recorded all of it. I probably would have watched it 100 times, laughing at the dark and absurd situation. Maybe I would have even sent the recording to him and his parents just so they could see the exact moment when I laid him down and stroked his hair. I wasn't trying to be threatening with that, and it wasn't as if I was doing it for some bizarre pleasure. Not that kind. At least it's that at that moment, he just seemed to be sleeping, and he made an even louder snoring noise than the first time. A few seconds later, when he woke up for the second time, he was as lost as before. And that's when, looking directly at him, I said, "You died, kid. Welcome to hell." At that moment, he wet his pants. The boy was so frightened that he simply lost control right there in front of me. As tears began to well up and his breathing became labored, I ended up giving him a hard slap across the face to prevent him from going into shock. I imagine he must have been at least 12 or 13 years old. In some cultures, that's considered almost an adult. And there he was, crying because of a few minutes of choking as retribution. I think at that moment his memory began to return because he was muttering, "Sorry, sorry," between sobs. I remained silent for a moment, absorbing the scene before me and thinking, I did this. I took control. I hadn't felt such pride in a long time. I could have done more, but I decided it was enough and that it was time to let him go. But not without a warning first. I told him that by invading my property, he was lucky I hadn't done anything worse, and that, like anyone else, I have the right to peace and privacy, and that this conflict ended here since it wasn't worth involving the police over a silly prank. In exchange, I hoped he would also keep everything secret. I warned that if he told anyone, if I even suspected he had talked about what happened, I would be capable of something terrible. Without beating around the bush, I said that if that happened, I would make his parents suffer in an indescribable way. I stated that I didn't care about the risk of being arrested, because I preferred to face that than deal with more problems on my own. I asked if he understood, and he nodded his head quickly before running off into the night with trembling legs and the smell of fear. In short, the boy opened his mouth, and since then, I've had police showing up at my door all year long, all because he didn't know how to keep quiet and accept the consequences as he should have, preferring to complain and play the victim. When the police came, I gave my version of the facts. A boy tried to break into my house, and all I did was show him it wasn't a good idea. I admitted that I held him, dragged him a bit, and then pushed him out of my yard, but of course, I omitted some details that I'm sure he fully deserved. I think that's fair. After all, he also didn't mention anything about throwing eggs at my window or stealing my sign. He forgot to tell that little part. And so the question remains, what's worse, causing damage and stealing property, or a small lesson for someone who needed to learn? He had no right to be on my property, much less to mess with my things. He played and found out how things work. And if they end up arresting me for it, maybe I'll fulfill the little promise I made to baby Tony Stark. Maybe I'll find out where he lives, where his parents rest, and make it clear that there are certain people you shouldn't mess with. In that case, I'd be quite excited to send an update directly from prison. On a Saturday night, October 30th, 2013, three men walked through the doors of a brick tavern called the Rising Moon, a one-story establishment situated in the town of Lake Harbor on the western shore of Michigan. Lake Harbor, a small town with about 1,000 residents, sits along the eastern coast of Lake Michigan. The special occasion was a Halloween party where the residents, many dressed in frightening costumes, gathered at the Rising Moon to drink and dance until the early hours of the morning. As they entered, the three men wore dark blue coveralls, with only their eyes and mouths visible beneath their black balaclavas. Their presence barely attracted attention from the patrons, who assumed the attire was simply part of the Halloween costumes of the night. However, the men weren't there to celebrate. They brought no joy or fun, but carried with them death. 1 week earlier, two men had been driving a blue Ford Focus from Detroit to Chicago. They parked near the corner where Morley's Fish Market stood on Grand Avenue. After removing a heavy gym bag from the trunk, they headed toward the store. Since it was past noon on a Saturday, the place was so busy that one of the men, Thomas Reed, needed to push his way through the crowd. Holding the bag with both hands, he intended to position it on the refrigerated counter in front of him. However, the 5-pound bag didn't carry seafood. Thomas Reed and Sean Kelly weren't ordinary deliverymen. They were members of the Midwestern Brotherhood, a domestic terrorist organization. And inside the bag, instead of fish, was a highly volatile homemade bomb. Reed planned to place the bomb on the counter, warn that there was an explosive device, and then instruct the owner and customers of the fish market to leave quickly. The civilians on the ground floor weren't the intended target. The bomb was actually aimed at those who were on the second floor of the shop. That day, the upper floor of Morley's Fish Market was the meeting point for leaders of the Midwestern Brotherhood's greatest rivals, a group known as the Lake Michigan Militia, LMM. Founded in the early 2000s as an organization that housed armed militant groups devoted to extreme anti-government ideologies, the LMM's mission was twofold: to protect what they called true American values, and to combat what they termed domestic traitors of their adversaries in the Midwestern Brotherhood. According to the information Reed and Kelly had received, members of the highest hierarchy of the LMM would be meeting in a room on the upper floor that afternoon. And with a single bomb positioned in the right place, it was possible that the entire leadership would be eliminated at once. Despite the Midwestern Brotherhood's careful planning, they made two crucial mistakes. The first was that the LMM meeting had ended hours earlier, leaving the second floor of the fish market completely empty. The LMM had a habit of spreading false information, even among their own lower-level operatives, to make it difficult to track their movements and meeting locations. Most believed the meeting would begin in the early afternoon, but in reality, it had already occurred in the morning, which meant that no members of the LMM leadership were present when the two Midwestern Brotherhood agents arrived with the bomb. This, however, was the lesser of the Midwestern Brotherhood's errors that day. The most serious was relying on an amateur bomb maker with little skill in explosives. While Sean Kelly waited near the entrance of the fish market with the function of guiding customers out, Thomas Reed lifted the gym bag to the refrigerated counter in front of him. Once he placed it, his plan was to announce there was a bomb and that all innocent civilians should evacuate the premises. But Reed didn't even have a chance to open his mouth. The moment he set the bag on the counter, the device suffered a catastrophic failure and detonated prematurely. Reed was killed instantly, the explosives vaporizing him almost completely. However, he wasn't the only one to lose his life. Joseph Morley, the 63-year-old owner of the fish market, died at the same instant the bomb exploded, as did his daughter Sharon, 29, and young Lee Murray, only 13 years old. The Midwestern Brotherhood did end up assassinating a member of the Lake Michigan militia. That day, Michael Davidson, 27, who was passing by to buy fish. However, their bomb also took the life of Davidson's partner, Evelyn Baker, and their 7-year-old daughter Michelle. George Williamson, 63, also died in the explosion alongside his wife Jillian, while Wilma McKay, 38, lost her life when she was crushed by the collapse of the old building, which gave way under the force of the explosion. In total, about 60 people were injured by fragments of masonry and glass shards that spread throughout the area. In the hours that followed, the bodies of the victims and injured survivors were removed from the rubble with the help of emergency services and volunteers in desperation. After the attack on Grand Avenue, Chicago's community was swept by a wave of indignation. Torrance Miston, a prominent member of the LMM, told a reporter, "Anyone who was on Grand Avenue that day, from a Boy Scout to grandmother, would have gone out to retaliate if you had given them a gun." Although the Midwestern Brotherhood had planned the attack with the intention of avoiding civilian casualties, the failure in execution made most interpret the bombing as a despicable and indiscriminate offensive against innocent citizens, and not as an action against the high command of the LMM on Grand Avenue. Chicago's residents believed that the bomb had worked as planned. However, Mad Dog Johnny Harris, leader of the LMM, knew this wasn't true. Harris knew that he and his close allies had been the real target, but as the commander of a sectarian militant group, he fomented tensions between communities as a form of sustenance and wouldn't let the opportunity pass. When leaving his house that night, he was stopped by the Chicago police. When questioned about his destination, he responded bluntly, "I'm going to plan a massacre." Stopping him would have meant risking their own comrades, so the police let him continue, knowing that causing deaths was his livelihood and that business was good. At Harris's request, the LMM leadership ordered immediate reprisals. A few hours after the bombing, the LMM claimed responsibility for the murder of a delivery driver, lured to a false call in the outskirts of Chicago. Then the group executed 2 other civilians in a shooting attack at a community center in Chicago, leaving 5 more people seriously injured. These attacks satisfied the LMM's desire for revenge, but also fulfilled a strategic purpose, distracting American security services, leading them to believe that Chicago civilians were the main target. With the redistribution of local security forces, more remote locations became exposed, like the bar and restaurant The Rising Moon in Lake Harbor, Michigan. When the LMM learned that the Rising Moon would host a Halloween party that Saturday, the leadership ordered Billy Farland, commander of their Michigan brigade, to prepare an attack. Farland called 3 of his main trusted men, Stephen Wilson, Jeffrey Davis, and Terrence Knight, with whom he arranged a meeting at a safe house near the bar. Gathered there, they established the base of operations and began planning the attack on the rising moon, including a reconnaissance mission. During this visit, they stopped at the bar for drinks and discreetly examined the entrances, exits, and firing positions. It's unsettling to imagine that just a few nights before the attack, these men drank alongside the same customers who would soon become targets. On the agreed night, Wilson, Davis, and Knight headed toward the rising moon in a stolen car, while a fourth man went ahead as a scout. Upon confirming that the party was in full swing, he signaled the LMM attack team, who parked the Honda Civic near the bar and entered the place wearing coveralls and balaclavas. The three were armed with an assault rifle, a shotgun, and a semi-automatic pistol. Initially, some of those present thought it was just a prank. There were even those who laughed upon seeing the men in coveralls with misaligned masks and old weapons that seemed like toys. But even if the weaponry appeared simple, it was nothing fictional. And as the patrons realized the gravity of the situation, the environment fell silent. Stephen Wilson, holding a variant of the AK called the VZ-58, found the terrified gaze of his victims and smiled. Raising the rifle, he shouted, "Trick or treat," before firing. Jeffrey Davis, with a 9mm pistol, fired once at a woman trying to escape, but soon his gun jammed, and he spent the rest of the attack trying to unjam it without the calm or skill necessary to do so. Terrence Knight, who had the shotgun, stayed by the entrance while the shooting happened, being the only one who didn't fire his weapon in an uncontrolled manner. Stephen Wilson, on the other hand, used his automatic assault rifle to unload 60 steel bullets into the bar patrons. In just over 10 seconds, he had already fired 30 heavy ammunition projectiles that, traveling at high velocity, tore through wooden structures of tables and chairs, pierced bodies opening large wounds, and scattered glass shards throughout the room that embedded in those present. Amid the chaos, when Wilson's rifle magazine emptied and he stopped shooting, an ominous silence fell over the bar, broken only by the groans of the seriously wounded. The devastating onslaught seemed to have ended, and survivors began to emerge from their hiding places. However, they soon realized that Wilson was reloading the rifle. A woman began to beg him to stop, but he ignored her, replaced the magazine, and fired the first bullet of the new cartridge into her skull. People ran to take shelter again, as Wilson once more fired haphazardly around, tearing through furniture and wounding anyone in his path. After emptying the second magazine, Wilson let out a laugh, observing the trail of death and destruction he had left. Still laughing, he exited, entered the stolen car, and escaped with his armed accomplices. The first responders who arrived described the scene as a true hell. Bodies of dead and wounded patrons were scattered across the dance floor, and entire sections of the floor had transformed into pools of blood and shattered glass. 8 people died instantly, while another 19 were taken to the hospital with serious injuries. Among the dead were Karen Thompson, 19, and Stephen Mullen, 20, as well as Maura Duddy, 59, and Joseph McDonald, 60. The list of those who lost their lives also included James Moore, 81, John Byan, 50, John Burns, 54, and Victor Montgomery, 76. The following day, the Lake Michigan militia claimed responsibility for the massacre, calling it an incursion. and stating that the deaths were a continuation of the threats against the nationalist electorate who would pay the price for the massacre of innocents that occurred earlier. A member of the LMM from Western Chicago stated that the shooters had information that senior members of the Midwestern Brotherhood frequented the Rising Moon. Unfortunately, they weren't there on Halloween night, but our boys acted according to the information they received. While the LMM's public relations wing responded with the coldness characteristic of conflicts, behind the scenes there was a repugnant celebration. The shooters were received as heroes upon their return, with Stephen Wilson particularly proud of his act of brutality. He boasted about executing a woman who begged for her life, considering that he exhibited the same lack of mercy that he attributed to those responsible for the attack on Morley's Fish Market. Due to the strong infiltration of FBI informants in paramilitary groups on both sides, identifying the shooters was relatively simple, as they spoke openly about their participation. The names of those responsible spread from pub to pub until reaching the ears of federal informants. In the weeks that followed, Stephen Wilson, Jeffrey Davis, and Terrence Knight were located, arrested, and taken into custody by the FBI. During the first court hearing, Knight was filmed laughing and insulting the victims' families before being escorted by officers. Jeffrey Davis remained silent, but Stephen Wilson, the main person responsible for the deaths and injuries, declared that his acts were revenge, and added that he felt no remorse. Finally, in early 2015, the three men were sentenced to life imprisonment for the massacre that became known as the Lake Harbor Massacre. Terrence Knight also received an additional life sentence for his involvement in the Cleveland Park killings, where 3 innocent people were shot dead by LMM shooters. All 3 should have spent the rest of their lives in prison, but due to legal technicalities and appeals based on procedural errors, Wilson, Davis, and Knight were given new sentencing hearings in 2021. Less than 6 years after the start of their supposedly lifetime sentences. Sean Kelly, the only survivor of the Midwestern Brotherhood group who prematurely detonated their device at Morley's Fish Market, also received a reduced sentence through a similar appeal process. As a reflection on this period, poet Alan Giles, born in Chicago, wrote a poem titled Progress, which expresses the spirit of this moment. They say for years Lake Harbor was behind the times, and it's nice now to see some progress. So I suppose we can expect to dig things back from the earth. I suppose the ambulances will leave the dying returned among the debris, to be explosively cured. With time, 100,000 particles of glass will create impossible patterns in the air, before merging into the clarity of a window, through which a reconstituted head will look out and admire the shy young man taking his bomb from the building and driving away home. On Halloween of 2015, I arranged to go trick-or-treating with my best friend Jake. We met up at my house right after school and spent some time there before getting ready. When the time came, we put on our costumes. I was Spider-Man and Jake was Batman. We started in my neighborhood, stopping door to door. Jake also lived nearby, but a bit farther away, several blocks distant. The walk to his place took about 20 minutes. Jake's mom came along with us, and on the way, we ended up going to his house. Our neighborhood was full of houses, and many other children were on the same candy mission. After several good hours of walking, we had filled our bags with candy. It was an incredible Halloween night. We went into Jake's house to enjoy the rest of the evening. My mom would pick me up at 10 to take me back home. Meanwhile, Jake and I stayed in his room, enjoying our candy and playing video games. Jake's parents and older sister were also home. At one point, we heard a knock on the front door and went to see what it was. We thought it must be more children, and Jake really wanted to be the one to distribute candy, since we hadn't had the chance to do that until then. He called to his parents in the next room, letting them know he would handle it himself. When we opened the door, we saw what appeared to be an adult man standing there. His head was down, wearing a hoodie that covered his entire face, making it difficult to see him clearly. He wasn't dressed up at all, which gave him a suspicious air, especially since it was already late. Jake and I had stayed out trick-or-treating until the permitted time limit. The man knocked on the door again, and we continued standing on the other side without saying a word. We left there and went straight to Jake's parents, saying there was a strange guy at the door. By that time, the knocking had already stopped, and when we went back to check, the man had disappeared. No one could explain who he was or what he was doing there, but it left us suspicious. After that, we returned to Jake's room to continue playing video games. Since the room was at the back of the house, I remember that maybe 15 minutes later, Jake called me, asking me to look out the window. When I did, I saw exactly what he was already observing. The same hooded man now standing in the backyard. He was about 40 feet from Jake's window, still with his head down, not looking in our direction. We stood there watching the man for a few seconds until we decided to leave the room. Jake went straight to his parents to tell them what was happening. They looked into the backyard and immediately turned on the patio light. As soon as the light came on, the man turned around and ran out of the yard. We never got a good look at his face, which made everything even weirder. After that scene, we thought he had really gone away, and concluded that maybe it was just someone wanting to scare others on Halloween. In the end, no one called the police, but the situation was quite strange. A little later, my mom arrived at Jake's house to pick me up. We went home quickly, and within a minute we were there. As soon as we arrived, I stayed in the living room for a while before finally needing to go to bed. When it got later, I went to my bedroom, which was also at the back of the house, just like Jake's. I turned off the lights and lay down. That's when, looking through my bedroom window, I noticed what appeared to be the same man from before outside. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. He was standing in my backyard, exactly as before in Jake's yard. For a moment I was frozen, trying to understand if it was real, but he was there. I ran out of the room and went to the living room to tell my parents about the man. We all went to another window at the back to try to get a better look, but when we got there, he had already disappeared. After a while, I went back to my room and lay down again, but it took me a long time to fall asleep. I stayed alert, watching the window for a good while, but the man didn't return. I eventually fell asleep. From that night on, I never saw him again. But the memory of that Halloween has stayed with me all these years. My parents tried to convince me it was just someone playing a Halloween prank. But the way he followed us from Jake's house to mine has always disturbed me. How did he know where I lived? Why was he watching us? Sometimes I still find myself looking out windows late at night, especially around Halloween, half expecting to see that hooded figure standing silently in the distance. The following year, Jake's family moved away to another state. We kept in touch for a while, but eventually drifted apart as childhood friends often do. I've often wondered if Jake ever had any similar experiences after that night, or if this strange visitor was somehow connected specifically to me. I guess some Halloween mysteries are never meant to be solved. It wasn't until last year, almost 10 years later, that I found a possible explanation. I was scrolling through a local news archive for a research project when I came across a story from October 2015. Apparently, a mental health facility about 5 miles from our neighborhood had reported a patient missing on Halloween night. The article included a grainy security camera image of a man in a hoodie leaving the grounds. The description matched perfectly. Tall, thin, always with his head down to avoid eye contact. According to the article, he had been found the next morning wandering near the lakefront, disoriented but harmless. The facility administrators stated that he had a history of escaping during holidays, drawn to family homes with children because he had lost his own family in a house fire years earlier. He never approached or spoke to anyone. He just watched from a distance, perhaps trying to recapture some semblance of the normal life he once had. I never told my parents about finding this article. Some part of me prefers to leave it as our personal Halloween mystery, a story I now tell around campfires to friends who don't believe me until they see the goosebumps on my arms. But on particularly dark October nights, I still check my backyard before going to sleep, just to be sure there's no hooded figure standing there, watching and waiting in silence. When I turned 35, I had finally saved enough money to fulfill my dream of buying my first house. Although it wasn't anything spectacular, and being completely honest, considering all factors, it wasn't in the best neighborhood of Portland. The sense of pride I felt was immense. Gradually, I got to know my closest neighbors, and in the first few weeks after moving in, I was pleasantly surprised that despite the neighborhood's reputation, people were quite friendly. Some even invited me over for dinner several times, something I hadn't experienced after years of living in different apartment complexes. Of course, not everyone was like that. 2 houses down from mine lived a man who appeared to be in his 60s. From the moment I moved in, he would show up at my door every couple of nights at very strange hours, asking for things. The first time, for example, he asked if I had any leftover bread I wasn't planning to eat. On another occasion, he asked for a bucket of water because the supply in his house had supposedly been interrupted. These requests, as random as they were, at least made some sense. However, when he started asking for money, I drew the line. I felt no obligation to constantly solve his problems, especially since I barely knew him. I gradually opened the door less and less, but that didn't reduce the frequency of his visits. Some weeks passed, and one night I heard another knock at my door. My first reaction was to ignore it, as I had grown accustomed to doing. But when I peeked through the peephole, I saw that he looked quite distressed. This made me reconsider, so I decided to open the door. I asked what he needed, and his response caught me completely off guard. He wanted me to come to his house to teach him how to use a new grill. It was almost midnight, which I thought was a very odd time to start grilling. But even so, against my better judgment, I decided to help. At that time, I was quite interested in culinary arts, so I figured spending 10 minutes explaining how a grill worked wouldn't be a big deal. I told him I'd come right over, just needed to put on my shoes. He thanked me and started heading back to his house. A few minutes later, I went to his place. When I opened the gate and entered the yard, I noticed it was very dark, making it difficult to see. To make matters worse, there was no sign of any grill. Moreover, he wasn't around either, though the back door was wide open. I reached my hand inside and called out, "I'm here. I'm down here. I need help getting the meat from the freezer," came a muffled response from a set of stairs to my left. I was reluctant to go down. There were no lights on down there. In fact, the entire house was dark. I shouted, asking if he could turn on a light so I could see better. After a few seconds of silence, he finally replied, "No, the lights are broken." At that moment, I realized something was very wrong. I yelled back something like, "I think I'm going to leave, man." No sooner had I finished speaking than I heard rapid footsteps coming up the stairs. My immediate reaction was to run. I sprinted back to my house, locked the door behind me, and went straight to the window. I pulled back the curtains to look outside, but saw nothing. I was completely terrified. I thought about calling the police, but decided against it, thinking I wouldn't have enough evidence of what had just happened. In the following days, I only left the house to go to work. During this time, I didn't see the man or hear any more knocks on my door late at night. Exactly 1 week later, I was talking to the neighbor across the street. The conversation eventually turned to what I had experienced, and I mentioned that I was thinking of moving because of it. He just looked at me with a puzzled expression. He informed me that nobody lived in the house I was talking about. It had been abandoned for 5 years. This prompted him to call the police. However, the police found nothing inside or around the house. I ended up moving a few weeks later, and that's all I know. I have no idea if anything more came of the situation. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted by luring me there. It all started in the winter, before I entered my second year of graduate school in Boston. I was looking for a place to live near campus as the new academic year approached. I found some interesting apartments, but they were all well above what I could afford. That's when I realized that if I wanted to live in the area, I would need a roommate to split the rent. I decided to post an ad on Craigslist explaining my situation, hoping someone would be interested. To my surprise, it didn't even take an hour to get a response. It was from an elderly woman, probably in her 70s. I had expected it would be a student from the same university, but in the end, it didn't matter much as long as she helped with half the rent. Besides, no one else showed interest during the entire following week, so I took advantage of this unique opportunity. When the semester began, we both moved in. She introduced herself as Margaret, a short lady with silver hair. Although she was somewhat reserved, she seemed like a good person. I believed we would get along well, so I wasn't worried about the months ahead. In the first few weeks, we hardly exchanged words. We would share a few quick sentences when we ran into each other in the kitchen. But that was it. Most of the time, she kept to herself in her room. Occasionally, while I watched TV in the living room at night, I would hear a high-pitched laugh coming from the other side of the wall. At first, I thought she was on the phone, but then I realized I never heard her talking, just laughing. This intrigued me, as I couldn't imagine what she was doing. As time passed, things started getting increasingly strange. For example, Margaret began to come out of her room just to watch me. She would stand in the kitchen or hallway, just staring at me while I watched TV or prepared dinner. You can imagine how uncomfortable this made me feel. One night around 3 a.m, I was awakened by a soft sound coming from my bedroom door. It wasn't a loud noise, but a slow, almost imperceptible knocking. I called out Margaret's name, and instantly the sound stopped. I knew it was her because right afterward, I heard her characteristic laugh and her footsteps returning to her room. It would be a lie to say this didn't scare me. There was no lock on my door, so nothing would prevent her from entering my room while I slept. I ended up staying awake for the rest of the night. The next day, I planned to talk to her about the situation, but she didn't leave her room at all. When night came again, I decided to push my desk in front of the door, making a kind of improvised barricade since, without a lock, I didn't feel comfortable with the idea that nothing would stop Margaret from entering my room. 3 hours later, I woke up to the sound of someone trying to force my bedroom door against the desk I had placed as a barrier. It was Margaret. I could see her eye peering through the crack of the partially open door. Before I could react, she started screaming and banging on the door forcefully. The desk began to give way, so I quickly got out of bed and held the door with my own hands. The screams and banging continued for about 2 minutes. When it finally stopped, I immediately called the police. As soon as they arrived and I opened the door, my heart nearly stopped. All the kitchen knives were stuck in the door. I was in complete shock, but tried to stay calm to explain the situation to the officers. I showed them which room Margaret was in. She resisted arrest a bit, but in the end, the police took her away. The following month, I moved to a new apartment, this time with real college roommates. To this day, I don't know what motivated Margaret to do what she did. My best guess is that she suffered from some serious mental condition and wasn't taking her medication. But at the same time, I also wonder if she really intended to use those knives on me that night. Fortunately, I took the precaution of blocking the door and didn't have to find out. This happened to me when I was just 8 years old. Since it was quite a long time ago, I don't remember every minute detail, but I'll try to keep the narrative as faithful as possible. During that period, I was living in a fairly isolated area in northern Michigan. The neighboring houses were about half a mile away, and because of this, although my family knew some neighbors, many were complete strangers. This included the resident of the house to the left of ours. I don't remember his name, but he was an older gentleman who lived there. To be honest, he terrified me. All the windows of his house were spray painted to prevent anyone from seeing inside, and the yard was overgrown with vegetation. I know all these details because Monday through Friday, I had to pass in front of his house on my way back from school. Every time I walked by, he would either stand on his porch watching me or try to start a conversation as I passed. This made me so uncomfortable that I began to hate the walk home just because I had to pass him. But the worst wasn't even that. Maybe once or twice a month, the man would walk the half-mile to our house in the middle of the night. He would then point a flashlight at my bedroom window. I knew it was him because once I saw him walking down the road toward our house. Thinking back, that was extremely concerning behavior. But at the time, I thought the best way to handle the situation was simply to ignore it. That's why I never told my parents anything. I also remember thinking that since my bedroom was on the second floor, he wouldn't be able to see much of what was inside anyway. Moving forward to a summer night that same year, I was awakened again by the light of a flashlight illuminating my bedroom. Only this time, a slight sound of something hitting the wall came right after. My heart seemed to have stopped at that instant. The only thing I could think of was that the sound was very much like a ladder being placed against the side of the house. Shortly after, my suspicions were confirmed. I heard a slight tap on the window glass. When I looked, I saw the smiling face of that man, making gestures for me to open the window. But I didn't open it. I screamed and ran to my parents' bedroom, desperately explaining that the neighbor was at my window. They came with me to the bedroom, but of course, he had already disappeared. The worst part was that my parents didn't even believe me, thinking I was imagining things. That's why they never called the police. However, to this day, even as an adult, I know exactly what I saw that night. I try not to think about what his intentions might have been regarding my 8-year-old self. After this incident, I never saw him again. In fact, less than a week later, his house was up for sale, which to me is even clearer proof that it was him. Since then, I've lived in many places, and no neighbor has ever been as frightening as that man. When I was studying law at a prestigious university in Edinburgh, I ended up moving into a shared house in the Stockbridge district during the final years of my studies. One of the things that attracted me to that place was that only one of the other apartments was already occupied. The challenge of living in a student house is that generally, these places are quite busy. You never know when someone will bring a crowd of friends from a party and spend the early hours of the morning blasting music in the kitchen or something similar. Clearly, this isn't good for maintaining a proper sleep routine. And the last thing I wanted was to compromise my crucial final year by living in an environment full of parties. With the help of some close friends, I moved all my things into the apartment one morning, already determined to go up and meet the resident of the upstairs floor, the only other person in the house. However, at one point as I was climbing the stairs with some bags, I looked up and saw someone watching me from the top of the staircase with an indifferent and cold expression. It was a relatively tall man with very short blonde hair and eyes of an extremely intense blue. They were so light they seemed to glow in their sockets, a disturbing shade of icy blue. I greeted him with a friendly "Hi," but instead of responding, he just stared at me for a few seconds before slowly moving away from the stairs. Soon after, I heard a door close as he went back to his apartment. The person who was with me gave me an uncomfortable, yet somewhat amused look, as we exchanged whispers about hoping he wouldn't be strange or something like that. Thinking about it now, that was a frighteningly prophetic moment. If only we had known how right we were. The first nights were quiet, and I was satisfied with the silence I had hoped to find. Everything continued this way until a certain night when I was sitting in my chair working on a research paper about international commercial law and heard something coming from the hallway. At first, I didn't pay much attention and just put on some ambient music, something that always helped me focus, and tried to ignore external noises. However, as the night progressed, the sounds became more intense, and curiosity eventually won out. I got up and went to the door, trying to identify what was happening. What I heard was the sound of screams, specifically from a woman, and it was coming from the upstairs apartment. At first, I thought the upstairs resident was watching some horror movie or something, which I imagined was the source of the screams. However, as I paid more attention, I realized that whatever it was just the sound of the woman screaming. Nothing else. It got to the point where I noticed that the audio, or whatever it was repeating in a loop. He was up there listening to the sound of a woman screaming in pain for over an hour. I knew I should go up and ask him to turn down the volume. But the idea that he was in his apartment listening to that, good heavens, it terrified me. It took hours until everything was quiet again. When the noise ceased, it was already past 2 in the morning, and only then could I even think about trying to sleep. As I lay in the dark, my mind was filled with questions. What kind of person listens to something like that for so long? And what if it was worse than it seemed, and he was watching something violently criminal, or perhaps even a snuff film? I spent hours awake, terrified of my new situation, one from which I couldn't easily escape since I had spent a fortune on fees and the first month's rent. These thoughts continued to torment me until I finally managed to fall asleep. The next day, I was so exhausted in my classes that my friends noticed my condition. They asked if I was okay, since apparently I looked horrible. I said I was fine, but mentioned that something was definitely wrong with the upstairs resident. Some friends tried to console me by sharing stories of strange roommates, saying that no matter how scary the guy appeared, at least he wasn't trying anything more invasive. In a way, they were right, but that night, the disturbance only increased. I became increasingly irritated by how inconsiderate he was, and I decided to gather my courage and go up to his apartment to ask him to turn down the volume. I knocked firmly on the door, hoping he would answer. One thing I should mention: I've had experiences with noisy neighbors before. Usually, as soon as you knock on the door, they lower the noise. People get embarrassed, apologize, and are generally reasonable. But with this guy, the noise didn't decrease. I can't explain how disturbing it was to hear what was coming from inside. To this day, I still don't know where those screams came from, whether it was a film, some weird music, or anything else. But I can tell you one thing: they sounded very real. They were terrifying, the kind of scream that only someone who knows they're going to die would make. I was trembling with fear when I heard the sound of the door being unlocked, and when it finally opened, what I saw was more disturbing than anything I could have imagined. The blonde man I had seen on the staircase a week before, or at least I presumed it was him, was wearing a mask. a mask that's difficult to describe even now, made of varnished wood. It looked like one of those death masks, a mold of a face right after death. But there was something extremely wrong with that mask. It was deformed, with indecipherable symbols or words etched into it. However, what really terrified me was the fact that, when he opened the door, he was completely naked. I immediately backed away, trying to put distance between myself and that masked man. Somehow, I still managed to politely ask if he could turn down the volume. He didn't move or say a word. He just stood there watching me through the holes cut in the mask. I continued backing away, my voice changing from a polite request to an almost desperate apology for having bothered him. But he remained motionless in silence, just watching me. When I saw the scars that covered his chest, I couldn't think of anything other than running back to my apartment. I locked the door behind me, almost in panic, trying to breathe as I grabbed the phone to call a friend who lived nearby. I asked if I could stay at his place for a while. He was curious, wanting to know why I was so disturbed, and more importantly, why I suddenly didn't want to stay in the apartment I had been so excited about until then. After I explained everything, he immediately invited me over, saying I could stay as long as I needed. After that, I contacted the police and filed a report for indecent exposure. However, the officer I spoke with said that without witnesses, it would just be my word against his, which would make it difficult to build a solid case. They recommended, frustrating as it was, that I simply avoid that disturbing neighbor as much as possible. I ended up moving out of that apartment as soon as I could. I went back during the day with some friends to get my things. Once again, the man from upstairs was there, watching from the staircase, staring at me without showing any emotion. It was then that I realized why the other apartments in the building were vacant. He had probably scared everyone else away too. In the end, I graduated with honors from law school and now work at a law firm in Manchester. I still have clear memories of my years in Edinburgh, but I try my best not to think about that empty building. My family and I lived in a deeply religious neighborhood in Idaho. I know the main reason we moved there was for the peace and safety of the place. Even though we weren't a super religious family, we still went to church on Sundays, among other activities. We thought it would be a great place to live, since the neighbors would also be Christians and good people. And indeed they were. Everyone was quite kind, but some people were definitely strange. For example, the neighbors who lived on the right side of our house. They appeared to be very good people, and in many ways they truly were, but in others, they were incredibly scary and bizarre. At the first dinner after we moved in, when they came to visit us, the entire family showed up to eat with us. Everything was going well, although it was difficult to converse with their children. They didn't have a television. So much of what my sister and I talked about simply didn't make sense to them. But as I mentioned, they were nice. And who needs a TV when you have a trampoline, right? In the middle of dinner, while the adults were chatting, and we were eating the homemade lasagna my mother had prepared, one of the children began to mumble something. It seemed like they were on the verge of a seizure, or something similar. They started saying a bunch of disconnected words. It wasn't another language, but it sounded like one long, rapid word said all at once. I remember my father standing up from the table, thinking of grabbing a pen or something in case the child was having an epileptic seizure, and asking the neighbor's father if the child was okay. I don't blame him for this, since the child's face was contorted as if they were suffering. But instead of going to the child to check, the neighbor's mother joined her hands with an expression of pride, while the father raised his arms to the sky, saying things like, praise be to God, for we are blessed." After that, he began to explain to us that from time to time, the child spoke in tongues, often being overtaken by the Holy Spirit and speaking the pure language of the seraphim. I only remember being completely terrified, as if I had never witnessed anything like it in my life. Another time, one morning, I woke up and went to brush my teeth in the bathroom. We had a frosted glass window that was slightly open, and through it, I heard some grunting sounds coming from the neighbor's yard. I opened the window a bit more, and what I saw shocked me. The neighbor's father was in the yard, holding a Bible in one hand and some kind of whip in the other. He was whipping himself on the back while reading passages from the Bible aloud, and he was hitting himself hard. His back was covered in cuts, and blood was trickling down. I ran to tell my mother and father what I had seen, and they doubted me for a moment until they witnessed the scene themselves. My father politely called our neighbor and asked him not to do that in the yard, and the neighbor promptly agreed not to repeat it within view of our house. Needless to say, we never invited them to dinner again. What still scares me to this day is how they could be so pleasant despite these violent tendencies. Although visibly disturbed, the neighbor's father was one of the warmest and friendliest guys I've ever met, at least in the image he projected. And I wonder if he was like that behind closed doors as well. I also wonder if the children were really as well adjusted as they appeared, or if they suffered more trauma from having grown up in such a strange environment. I come from a small town in the Pacific Northwest called Willowbrook. It's a charming place, known to many as the town of pines. I love Willowbrook, but I can no longer live there. There are too many painful memories for me, and people blame me for something I didn't do. 6 years ago, I lived next door to a family called the Harringtons. They seemed like very kind people, but faced financial difficulties because Thomas, the man of the house, couldn't find employment for some reason. There were rumors in the neighborhood that Thomas didn't work because of an illness, but he helped support his family by making and selling pastries to the neighbors, including me. Thomas's pastries and meat pies were the best, traditional recipes that everyone adored. Many times, he appeared at my door with a tray of fresh pastries for sale. They were inexpensive and delicious, and I know I wasn't the only one in the neighborhood who bought them regularly. It was gratifying to be able to contribute to his family's income this way. Some people said Thomas had mental problems, but it seemed clear that he was also dealing with some physical condition. Sometimes he would start laughing out of nowhere when he came to my house, as if he had heard a joke that only he understood. Other times, his arm would tremble while holding the tray of pastries. One day, he began bleeding from his nose, letting the blood drip onto the pastries. He apologized repeatedly, visibly embarrassed as he walked away. But when I said it was okay, and that I hoped he would get better soon, he let out a high-pitched laugh and disappeared around the corner. Thomas sometimes acted very strangely, but I only felt sorry for him and even admired him for his determination to support his family by working hard selling delicious food. However, one day I came home from work and found several police cars in front of the Harringtons' house. The entire neighborhood had come out of their homes to see what was happening, and we were shocked when a forensic team showed up. They were those police officers who wear white jumpsuits and masks, specialized in murder cases and searching for body parts. Many rumors began to circulate about what the family might be involved in, but it didn't take long for the truth to come out. Within a day, photos were in all the newspapers, and the story was spreading through local radio and TV stations. Human remains were discovered in the Harringtons' backyard and were identified as belonging to a homeless man named Edward, who had disappeared some time before. The reports indicated that the Harringtons had lured him to the house under the pretext of needing help with yard work, but then killed him and buried the body in the backyard. We were all shocked by the news, but as time passed, even more disturbing revelations emerged about the murders. I will never forget the day the police held a press conference with journalists from all over the country. They stated they had found a 50-page notebook written by Thomas, which he had titled Confessions of a Schizophrenic. In the notebook, Thomas talked about how he heard voices in his head that commanded him to kill men, claiming that his actions were part of a satanic purification ritual, and that he had a plan to purify the world and reduce the population. The situation was extremely disturbing and distressing, because I never imagined Thomas could have such thoughts. He always seemed so gentle to me, but clearly I was wrong to think so. As the weeks passed, we heard even worse reports, things that ended up destroying the life I knew. The forensic teams analyzed the Harringtons' house and found traces of the murdered man's body in the family's kitchen utensils. Additionally, large pieces of meat were missing from the more recently buried bodies in the yard. The police came to a frightening conclusion. The family was dismembering the victims before cooking and consuming their flesh. What made it all even more horrible was when rumors began to emerge that besides practicing cannibalism, the family was selling some of this meat to the community in their pastries and pies. I was horrified to hear this because I myself had bought Thomas's pastries many times, and besides eating them, I found them delicious. I remember sitting on the couch watching TV when the news was broadcast. Suddenly, the room began to spin, and I felt completely numb, unable to process what I was hearing. It was at that terrible moment that everything became clear. I had unknowingly eaten human meat. I ran to the bathroom and violently vomited. All of this was already traumatic enough for me. But things got worse when rumors began to spread that the entire community was involved in some sort of satanic cult, and that we all knew what we were eating. People from all over town came to our neighborhood to harass us, including me. Despite our constant denials, they called us cannibals and warned us that we were no longer welcome in Willowbrook. Personally, I found an anonymous note on my door threatening me with death if I didn't leave town. Fearing for my life, I decided to leave Willowbrook and moved to a coastal city far away, where I now live alone. Since then, I've stopped eating meat altogether. I became a vegetarian because the taste of meat brings back horrible memories, and every time I try it, I get sick and vomit almost instantly. Now perhaps you understand why I prefer not to reveal my name or give too many details about where I live. I'm afraid of being hunted by people seeking revenge for the terrible crimes committed by Thomas Harrington. But I swear on everything sacred that I didn't know what I was eating. If I had known, I would never have eaten it and would have reported Thomas to the police immediately. So please think, as much as you believe you know your neighbors, do you really know who they are? Do you know what they do behind closed doors? Sometimes the truth about who lives next to us only appears when it's already too late. I come from a small town in the Pacific Northwest called Willowbrook. It's a charming place, known to many as the Town of Pines. I love Willowbrook, but I can no longer live there. There are too many painful memories for me, and people blame me for something I didn't do. 6 years ago, I lived next door to a family called the Harringtons. They seemed like very kind people, but faced financial difficulties because Thomas, the man of the house, couldn't find employment for some reason. There were rumors in the neighborhood that Thomas didn't work because of an illness, but he helped support his family by making and selling pastries to the neighbors, including me. Thomas's pastries and meat pies were the best, traditional recipes that everyone adored. Many times, he appeared at my door with a tray of fresh pastries for sale. They were inexpensive and delicious, and I know I wasn't the only one in the neighborhood who bought them regularly. It was gratifying to be able to contribute to his family's income this way. Some people said Thomas had mental problems, but it seemed clear that he was also dealing with some physical condition. Sometimes he would start laughing out of nowhere when he came to my house, as if he had heard a joke that only he understood. Other times, his arm would tremble while holding the tray of pastries. One day, he began bleeding from his nose, letting the blood drip onto the pastries. He apologized repeatedly, visibly embarrassed as he walked away. But when I said it was okay, and that I hoped he would get better soon, he let out a high-pitched laugh and disappeared around the corner. Thomas sometimes acted very strangely, but I only felt sorry for him and even admired him for his determination to support his family by working hard selling delicious food. However, one day I came home from work and found several police cars in front of the Harringtons' house. The entire neighborhood had come out of their homes to see what was happening, and we were shocked when a forensic team showed up. They were those police officers who wear white jumpsuits and masks, specialized in murder cases and searching for body parts. Many rumors began to circulate about what the family might be involved in, but it didn't take long for the truth to come out. Within a day, photos were in all the newspapers, and the story was spreading through local radio and TV stations. Human remains were discovered in the Harringtons' backyard and were identified as belonging to a homeless man named Edward, who had disappeared some time before. The reports indicated that the Harringtons had lured him to the house under the pretext of needing help with yard work, but then killed him and buried the body in the backyard. We were all shocked by the news, but as time passed, even more disturbing revelations emerged about the murders. I will never forget the day the police held a press conference with journalists from all over the country. They stated they had found a 50-page notebook written by Thomas, which he had titled Confessions of a Schizophrenic. In the notebook, Thomas talked about how he heard voices in his head that commanded him to kill men, claiming that his actions were part of a satanic purification ritual, and that he had a plan to purify the world and reduce the population. The situation was extremely disturbing and distressing, because I never imagined Thomas could have such thoughts. He always seemed so gentle to me, but clearly I was wrong to think so. As the weeks passed, we heard even worse reports, things that ended up destroying the life I knew. The forensic teams analyzed the Harringtons' house and found traces of the murdered man's body in the family's kitchen utensils. Additionally, large pieces of meat were missing from the more recently buried bodies in the yard. The police came to a frightening conclusion. The family was dismembering the victims before cooking and consuming their flesh. What made it all even more horrible was when rumors began to emerge that besides practicing cannibalism, the family was selling some of this meat to the community in their pastries and pies. I was horrified to hear this because I myself had bought Thomas's pastries many times, and besides eating them, I found them delicious. I remember sitting on the couch watching TV when the news was broadcast. Suddenly, the room began to spin, and I felt completely numb, unable to process what I was hearing. It was at that terrible moment that everything became clear. I had unknowingly eaten human meat. I ran to the bathroom and violently vomited. All of this was already traumatic enough for me. But things got worse when rumors began to spread that the entire community was involved in some sort of satanic cult, and that we all knew what we were eating. People from all over town came to our neighborhood to harass us, including me. Despite our constant denials, they called us cannibals and warned us that we were no longer welcome in Willowbrook. Personally, I found an anonymous note on my door threatening me with death if I didn't leave town. Fearing for my life, I decided to leave Willowbrook and move to a coastal city far away, where I now live alone. Since then, I've stopped eating meat altogether. I became a vegetarian because the taste of meat brings back horrible memories, and every time I try it, I get sick and vomit almost instantly. The investigation later revealed that Thomas had killed and processed at least 7 men over a 3-year period. Each victim had been carefully selected, usually drifters or homeless individuals who wouldn't be immediately missed. What disturbed investigators most was the methodical way he documented each processing in his notebook, complete with recipes and notes on which cuts tasted best in which pastries. Now perhaps you understand why I prefer not to reveal my name or give too many details about where I live. I'm afraid of being hunted by people seeking revenge for the terrible crimes committed by Thomas Harrington. But I swear on everything sacred that I didn't know what I was eating. If I had known, I would never have eaten it and would have reported Thomas to the police immediately. His wife and teenage son claimed they never knew what was in the pastries either. But investigators remained skeptical. How could they not notice the late-night activities in their basement or the strange odors from their kitchen? The courts eventually found them complicit, though with reduced sentences compared to Thomas. So please think, as much as you believe you know your neighbors, do you really know who they are? Do you know what they do behind closed doors? Sometimes the truth about who lives next to us only appears when it's already too late. I I come from a small town in the Pacific Northwest called Willowbrook. It's a charming place, known to many as the town of pines. I love Willowbrook, but I can no longer live there. There are too many painful memories for me, and people blame me for something I didn't do. 6 years ago, I lived next door to a family called the Harringtons. They seemed like very kind people, but faced financial difficulties because Thomas, the man of the house, couldn't find employment for some reason. There were rumors in the neighborhood that Thomas didn't work because of an illness, but he helped support his family by making and selling pastries to the neighbors, including me. Thomas's pastries and meat pies were the best, traditional recipes that everyone adored. Many times, he appeared at my door with a tray of fresh pastries for sale. They were inexpensive and delicious, and I know I wasn't the only one in the neighborhood who bought them regularly. It was gratifying to be able to contribute to his family's income this way. Some people said Thomas had mental problems, but it seemed clear that he was also dealing with some physical condition. Sometimes he would start laughing out of nowhere when he came to my house, as if he had heard a joke that only he understood. Other times, his arm would tremble while holding the tray of pastries. One day, he began bleeding from his nose, letting the blood drip onto the pastries. He apologized repeatedly, visibly embarrassed as he walked away. But when I said it was okay, and that I hoped he would get better soon, he let out a high-pitched laugh and disappeared around the corner. Thomas sometimes acted very strangely, but I only felt sorry for him and even admired him for his determination to support his family by working hard selling delicious food. However, one day I came home from work and found several police cars in front of the Harringtons' house. The entire neighborhood had come out of their homes to see what was happening, and we were shocked when a forensic team showed up. They were those police officers who wear white jumpsuits and masks, specialized in murder cases and searching for body parts. Many rumors began to circulate about what the family might be involved in, but it didn't take long for the truth to come out. Within a day, photos were in all the newspapers, and the story was spreading through local radio and TV stations. Human remains were discovered in the Harringtons' backyard and were identified as belonging to a homeless man named Edward, who had disappeared some time before. The reports indicated that the Harringtons had lured him to the house under the pretext of needing help with yard work, but then killed him and buried the body in the backyard. We were all shocked by the news, but as time passed, even more disturbing revelations emerged about the murders. I will never forget the day the police held a press conference with journalists from all over the country. They stated they had found a 50-page notebook written by Thomas, which he had titled Confessions of a Schizophrenic. In the notebook, Thomas talked about how he heard voices in his head that commanded him to kill men, claiming that his actions were part of a satanic purification ritual, and that he had a plan to purify the world and reduce the population. The situation was extremely disturbing and distressing, because I never imagined Thomas could have such thoughts. He always seemed so gentle to me, but clearly I was wrong to think so. As the weeks passed, we heard even worse reports, things that ended up destroying the life I knew. The forensic teams analyzed the Harringtons' house and found traces of the murdered man's body in the family's kitchen utensils. Additionally, large pieces of meat were missing from the more recently buried bodies in the yard. the police came to a frightening conclusion. The family was dismembering the victims before cooking and consuming their flesh. What made it all even more horrible was when rumors began to emerge that besides practicing cannibalism, the family was selling some of this meat to the community in their pastries and pies. I was horrified to hear this because I myself had bought Thomas's pastries many times, and besides eating them, I found them delicious. I remember sitting on the couch watching TV when the news was broadcast. Suddenly, the room began to spin, and I felt completely numb, unable to process what I was hearing. It was at that terrible moment that everything became clear. I had unknowingly eaten human meat. I ran to the bathroom and violently vomited. All of this was already traumatic enough for me. But things got worse when rumors began to spread that the entire community was involved in some sort of satanic cult, and that we all knew what we were eating. People from all over town came to our neighborhood to harass us, including me. Despite our constant denials, they called us cannibals and warned us that we were no longer welcome in Willowbrook. Personally, I found an anonymous note on my door threatening me with death if I didn't leave town. Fearing for my life, I decided to leave Willowbrook and move to a coastal city far away, where I now live alone. Since then, I've stopped eating meat altogether. I became a vegetarian because the taste of meat brings back horrible memories, and every time I try it, I get sick and vomit almost instantly. The investigation later revealed that Thomas had killed and processed at least 7 men over a 3-year period. Each victim had been carefully selected, usually drifters or homeless individuals who wouldn't be immediately missed. What disturbed investigators most was the methodical way he documented each processing in his notebook, complete with recipes and notes on which cuts tasted best in which pastries. Now perhaps you understand why I prefer not to reveal my name or give too many details about where I live. I'm afraid of being hunted by people seeking revenge for the terrible crimes committed by Thomas Harrington. But I swear on everything sacred that I didn't know what I was eating. If I had known, I would never have eaten it and would have reported Thomas to the police immediately. His wife and teenage son claimed they never knew what was in the pastries either. But investigators remained skeptical. How could they not notice the late-night activities in their basement or the strange odors from their kitchen? The courts eventually found them complicit, though with reduced sentences compared to Thomas. So please think, as much as you believe you know your neighbors, do you really know who they are? Do you know what they do behind closed doors? Sometimes the truth about who lives next to us only appears when it's already too late. When my wife and I moved to Oak Ridge, Colorado, it was undoubtedly one of the most memorable moments of our lives. I've always had a soft spot for Denver with its mountain backdrop and vibrant downtown. But the constant bustle of the city can wear anyone down. There comes a point when the fast pace stops making sense, and all you want is a quieter life. It took time to save money and get a few promotions in our careers. But when everything fell into place, we decided to go all in and make the move. It seemed like we had found our little paradise in the suburbs. Oak Ridge was a peaceful place with excellent schools and more than 15 parks scattered throughout the town. In fact, it gave the impression that the whole town was one big park. a true sea of green compared to the concrete jungle that was Denver. Plus, the big city was only a half-hour drive away, or 45 minutes with heavier traffic, so this move wouldn't affect our careers. We thought we were living the dream, but in a short time, that dream turned into a nightmare, something neither my wife nor I could have predicted. Our house was on Cedar Lane, and we had a good relationship with our neighbors on both sides. On one side, a young couple with a baby, with whom we always had barbecues on the weekends to unwind after a week of work. On the other side lived a lovely retired couple. They were quite calm and discreet. I mean, they were of an advanced age and weren't as eager to interact with the neighborhood as the younger residents. I would have been more concerned about them if it weren't for their grandson, Nathan, who lived with them. He was a nurse at the local hospital and always helped with household chores, making sure they had everything they needed. I felt grateful knowing they were well taken care of. One day, returning home after a particularly exhausting day at work, I spotted something on the road that completely contrasted with the neighborhood's tranquil environment. It was a small, furry figure, stained with the dark red of dried blood, something lifeless lying by the side of the perfectly paved street. A dead cat. I felt my heart sink for that poor animal. Whoever had run it over apparently didn't bother to stop and clean up the situation, which left me both irritated and sad. I understand it might be difficult for some people. Perhaps they were in shock, afraid of the consequences. But honestly, leaving the cat there exposed for the neighborhood children to see was completely inappropriate. My house was about 100 yards away, so I parked the car in the garage, grabbed a trash bag from the kitchen, and went back to the street. I didn't even greet my wife, which made her immediately realize something was wrong. She followed me outside, horrified to see me wrapping the little cat's body in the black trash bag. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't just throw it in the regular trash, as if it were anything else. That kitten was certainly someone's pet, and perhaps its family would want to give it a dignified burial. I love animals. What else could I do? I kept the cat's fragile body in the garage freezer and waited for someone to post missing signs around the neighborhood, hoping to be able to give the news to the family. However, days passed and no signs appeared. Shortly after, I took the body to the city's animal shelter and tried to move on, erasing that episode from my memory. A few days later, on a muggy Saturday morning, I was preparing for my morning run when I spotted the neighbor's grandson getting out of his car with one of those animal carrier boxes. I hadn't yet had the opportunity to introduce myself to him, so I walked down my driveway, giving him a warm good morning. He returned the greeting in a friendly manner, and I took the chance to ask what he had in the box. He explained it was a new cat he had adopted through Craigslist, something to cheer up his grandparents and bring more affection to their final years. I thought the gesture was extremely kind, and without mentioning the cat that had recently died in the neighborhood, I suggested he keep the pet indoors, as cats can end up getting lost and never returning. He assured me that was exactly the plan, as his grandmother wouldn't take her eyes off the little kitty after seeing how adorable it was. This brought me great relief. I really wasn't ready to deal with the idea of having to wrap another little animal in a trash bag, not after the last one. So I told him how lucky his grandparents were to have such a thoughtful grandson, and continued with my morning run. The next day, the younger neighbor from the house next door came knocking at my door and said he needed to talk to me. I silently said a prayer that he wasn't coming to cancel our barbecue that afternoon, since it was our turn to handle the meats, and I didn't want to have to put everything in the freezer for a week, especially considering that until very recently, that freezer had served as a kind of makeshift coffin for the dead cat I found on the road. But no, he had a serious expression, so I already imagined the barbecue would be canceled. However, the news was even worse. In a low tone, he asked me to accompany him to his garage entrance. I followed, and then he asked me a question in the same whispered voice. I'll try to recall the conversation as faithfully as possible. Did you hear or see anything strange last night? I don't think so. What kind of thing should I have noticed? I don't know, like the scream of a cat being attacked or something like that. No, man, I didn't hear anything. What happened? Just come take a look. David led me to the front garden of his house, where some rose bushes grew that I had seen his wife pruning a few times. Beneath the bushes was another tragic scene. Blood and fur scattered around, another dead cat. But this one appeared to have been recently attacked, torn apart in a way that left me perplexed. Do you think it could have been a mountain lion? Asked David. I don't think mountain lions come this close to town, but I don't know, anything's possible, I responded, still shaken, and not really understanding what was happening. But if something killed this cat right here in your yard last night, wouldn't we have heard something? I should have heard something. I really didn't know what to answer. I know that in the end, it was just a cat, but it left us terrified, and I particularly felt even more disturbed since this was the second dead cat I had found on our street, Cedar Lane, in just a few weeks. We ended up deciding that we would keep an eye out for anything suspicious and meet later for the Sunday barbecue as planned. Before my wife and I went to David's house, I made sure to stop by the other neighbor's house, just to ensure their cat was okay. Shortly after ringing the doorbell, the neighbor's grandmother opened the door. I had barely begun to ask about the cat when I heard a high-pitched meow coming from inside the house. The grandmother apologized, explaining that she needed to close the door before the kitten tried to escape. I smiled, said I understood, wished her a good morning, and went back home, relieved. The barbecue that afternoon was a bit strange. David and his wife seemed out of sorts, and in the end, I ended up telling my wife what was happening. 2 dead cats had mysteriously appeared in the last few weeks on our street. She was quite shaken, but deep down, I felt relieved to have told her because a few days later, something important happened. My wife sometimes works from home, since her job offers a lot of flexibility. I was at the office in Denver when my cell phone started vibrating with several messages from her. She asked me to call as soon as possible, and the subject was about the cats. As soon as I could, I returned the call, and she told me what had happened. She had run into Nathan, the neighbor's grandson, at Walmart and went up to him to chat. While talking, she noticed something strange. His arm was covered in cuts with scabs running up and down his forearm, deep cuts. Concerned, she commented that they must be painful, but Nathan just laughed and said the injuries had occurred at work when an elderly patient became agitated during a routine procedure at the hospital. But from my wife's trembling voice, it was clear she didn't believe the story. She was certain Nathan was lying. Those cuts were from cat claws, and she recognized this type of scratch from a mile away, having grown up surrounded by cats. One scratch in particular was quite evident, parallel lines. And if Nathan was telling the truth, that patient would need to have the smallest hands in the world to leave such characteristic marks. After that, my wife became completely convinced that Nathan had something to do with the cat deaths happening in our neighborhood. And her fears only increased when we received a letter from the Homeowners Association. The letter mentioned that several other dead cats had been found in yards and parks in the area. But curiously, no family had reported their pets missing. That's when we turned into amateur detectives. We were certain that whoever was killing the cats wasn't simply taking animals from the neighborhood. We thought they were being brought from outside, perhaps even purchased from places like Craigslist. But we couldn't simply accuse Nathan of something so horrible, especially because the cat he had brought for his grandparents seemed to be alive and well. Or at least that's what we thought. One night, my wife was once again spying through the kitchen window, observing the neighbor's house. She had been doing this quite frequently lately, and I was beginning to think her suspicion of Nathan was bordering on paranoia. All she had seen was him taking care of household chores for his grandparents. But that night, while I was watching the highlights of a football game, I heard her scream. "Oh my God!" She ran to the living room, frightened. When I asked what had happened, she told me she had just seen Nathan taking a trash bag outside, but the bag looked strangely light, as if it had something the size of a cat inside. At that moment, I just wanted to clarify everything once and for all. So I agreed to wait until dark to check what was in the trash cans. When night fell, I made sure no one was around and went to the neighbor's trash cans to check. And there it was, right on top of the bin, inside a black bag. The body of a dead, mutilated cat, exactly like the one David had found in his garden. It was the same cat that Nathan had bought on Craigslist, the striped kitten that I had seen at his grandparents' house days before when I went to ensure everything was okay. I returned inside with as much calm as I could muster, and without wasting time, called the police. In less than an hour, a patrol car appeared in front of Nathan's house. My wife and I watched from the window as the police talked to his grandparents before entering for a search. When we saw Nathan coming out in handcuffs, my wife couldn't contain herself. She ran outside, shouting insults of pure rage. Days later, the story was in all the news outlets. Nathan was formally charged with 12 counts of animal abuse after confessing to the police that he used Craigslist to get cats that he tortured and killed. According to his testimony, he never intended to care for any of the animals. His plan was always to strangle or drown them in his grandparents' backyard. And the worst part of this horrible story wasn't even the end, not by a long shot. Nathan confessed to the police that he had dismembered some of the cats, ripping off their heads or cutting off their limbs. He would also stomp on the animals' heads before removing them, and would dispose of the remains by scattering them throughout the neighborhood in a deliberate attempt to frighten the residents of Cedar Lane. The last news I heard was that he was being held in the county jail with bail set at $50,000, which his devastated and horrified grandparents had no intention of paying. What haunts me about this story isn't just what Nathan did, but the fact that he seemed to be the least likely person to commit such acts. He appeared to be such a polite young man, always dedicated to his work as a nurse and taking care of his grandparents at home. When I met him, I thought he was almost a saint, but now all of that was just a mask. Nathan had something dark inside him, and I'm extremely relieved that we discovered it before he could hurt anyone else or another animal. The most troubling revelation came during the trial, when forensic psychologists testified that people who torture animals often escalate to human victims. The prosecutor revealed that police had found notebooks where Nathan detailed plans to eventually target elderly patients at the hospital. He'd been practicing on cats to prepare for his real work. That thought still gives me nightmares, knowing how close our elderly neighbors came to potentially becoming his first human victims. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.